motion. This is something they have rightly not seen fit to do. Today marks the 417th consecutive day in which you have led the Department of Labor, DOL, as acting secretary without the constitutionally required advice and consent of the Senate. In effectively abrogating the Senate nomination process, the Biden administration has treated the Constitution as but a footnote. That is unacceptable. In fact, Ms. Sue, you are now the longest-serving acting secretary since before the U.S. Civil War, a record that was best left unbroken. As we examine the Biden administration's fiscal year 2025 budget request for DOL, it's important to keep that in mind. These unprecedented times demand the strictest possible scrutiny. To begin with, the FY 2025 DOL budget requests an increase to $14.2 billion in discretionary spending to support the, quote, work, end quote, of more than 15,600 bureaucrats. By work, I mean showing up in person just 5 days over a 2-week span, as is DOL's official policy. Moreover, as the old saying goes, the budget isn't just a collection of numbers. The budget is a statement of priorities. And overzealous regulatory action has been a blatant priority of the Biden administration. The FY 2025 DOL budget asks of the average American, quote, invest in the Davis-Bacon rule, which will make federal construction projects more unaffordable. Quote, invest in the overtime rule, which will force employers to cut hours. Invest in the independent contractor rule, which will bankrupt freelancers across the country. Invest in the fiduciary rule, which will limit options for individuals to invest in their own financial future. And invest in an expansion of DOL's power over apprenticeships, which will decimate the role of states and further handcuff employers. While the Biden administration likes to misuse the word invest, Americans see what it really means: a tax on workers and business in terms of both time and money. Money and effort that rightly belong to the taxpayer alone. The priorities pursued by this administration are detrimental to American workers, job creators, and taxpayers, the very people DOL should be serving. Instead, DOL regulations have served the interest of big labor union bosses. That the administration would install an acting secretary to carry out what I see as a very radical vision raises serious concerns for this committee. Don't take my word for it. American views of the Biden-Sue economy have soured in poll after poll. Pew Research finds that 26% of the electorate rates economic conditions as excellent or good, while 73% regards them as just fair or poor. 22% believe that they're better off than they were 4 years ago, compared to 52% who believe they are worse off. The American people cite inflation, cost of living, and the lack of good-paying jobs as their top 3 concerns. In other words, when it comes to your record, the American people aren't buying what you're selling. I see at least 3 underlying economic conditions that explain why. First, Americans are being crushed under the weight of inflation. Groceries cost over 25% more than when Biden took office, and the real median wages haven't kept pace. Second, the mirage of job growth is also subsidized by gains in the public sector. It hasn't escaped my notice that over the last 2 months, the Bureau of Labor Statistics reported that employment growth in the government sector was second only to growth in the healthcare sector. In March, the healthcare sector edged out the government sector by only about 1,000 jobs. In 2023, nearly 25% of added jobs were government positions, which inevitably will be paid for by private sector jobs. Third, job growth can be exclusively attributed to foreign-born workers. Foreign-born workers have gained nearly 4 million jobs over pre-pandemic levels. Conversely, native-born workers are still down over 1 million jobs since the beginning of the pandemic. Republicans will unleash the American economy. We will curb reckless spending, promote growth and innovation, cut through regulatory red tape, and create more opportunities in skills development. Thank you, and I yield to the ranking member for an opening statement.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Fox. Acting Secretary Sue, good morning. I think it is important to note that your service as Acting Secretary has been verified as constitutionally proper by the Government Accountability Office, so there's no question as to whether or not you are serving consistent with the Constitution. So welcome back. It's great to have you appear before us on May Day, a day in which people from all over the world can come together and recognize the importance of the labor movement. Under your leadership, the Department of Labor has invested in registered apprenticeship opportunities for job seekers and championed a pro-worker regulatory agenda that includes protecting mine workers from silica dust, expanding overtime protections for millions of workers, ensuring that workers receive retirement investment advice that is in their best interest. The department has also worked with the Biden administration to repeal the harmful restrictions imposed by the previous administration that allowed unscrupulous employers to misclassify workers as independent contractors, which would deny them the benefits of being an employee, such as minimum wage, overtime, workers' compensation, unemployment compensation, OSHA protections, health and pension benefits enjoyed by other employees, just to name a few. And also know that you're working on self-insurance for the Black Lung Disease Program. So since President Biden took office, more than 12.2 million jobs have been created. This historic economic progress is indicative of congressional Democrats and administration's commitment to supporting workers, businesses, and families. A perfect example of our commitment is when congressional Democrats and President Biden saved the pensions of over 1 million retirees by saving the multi-employer pension funds. We also saved tens of thousands of businesses from going under. Those businesses were legally obligated to pay into the failing funds until the businesses went broke. We saved them too. As a reminder, not a single congressional Republican voted in favor of this fix, even though the cost of the fix was less than we calculated we were on the hook for in future expenses. In stark contrast, House Republicans have prioritized policies that undermine workers and supported destructive budget cuts at the Department of Labor. Today, we'll hear committee Republicans continue to attempt to discredit our economy's performance under President Biden and your leadership. For example, the record number of jobs, they consider that bad economy. Under the previous administration, worst job performance in almost 100 years, and they praise that as good economy. You can't make it up. You have to look at the numbers. However, the undisputable fact is, according to the Department of Labor, the unemployment rate of President Biden has remained below 4% for the longest time in 50 years. That's a good economy. I also want to remind my colleagues that despite what the committee Republicans may say, every Democratic administration since President Kennedy has left for their Republican successors a better budget deficit situation than the one they inherited. And every Republican administration since Nixon left for their Democratic successors a worse deficit situation than they inherited, without exception. And using every microeconomic metric, the economy does better when Democrats are in charge. Today's hearing is an opportunity to set the record straight and tell the truth. President Biden and Acting Secretary Sue have worked to support workers, businesses, and our economy. and will continue to focus on concrete solutions to put money back into workers' pockets, keep workers healthy and safe on the job, ensure all workers can enjoy a dignified retirement, and protect children from being forced to work in illegal and dangerous conditions. To that end, committee Democrats released a new report just yesterday entitled "A Slap on the Wrist: How It Pays for Unscrupulous Employers to Take Advantage of Workers." The report details how employers feel emboldened to violate labor laws because of weak or non-existent civil monetary penalties. Monetary penalties are supposed to serve as a deterrent and hold employers accountable for labor law violations. However, today they have become, in some cases, the cost of doing business. In other cases, no sanctions at all. Later this month, the committee Democrats will introduce legislation to responsibly increase these penalties to deter employers from violating workers' rights. I hope our Republican colleagues will put politics aside and work with us to deliver on these priorities. So thank you, Ms. Sue, for your leadership and joining us today, and thank you and the Department of Labor for all that you've done for the workers of America. And also I want to thank you for being responsive to oversight requests made by our committee. We may hear that the committee has sent letters. I'm delighted to know that you have responded to the majority's 25 oversight letters, and that's how it should be. You should be making those responses, and I don't need to remind anybody, but I will. The previous administration was not nearly as responsive to Congress's oversight requests as this one has been. In most cases, they just ignored our requests altogether. So throughout the hearing, I hope we remain focused on what is most important: improving the lives of workers and their families. So thank you, Acting Secretary Sue, and Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Scott. Pursuant to Committee Rule 8C, all members who wish to insert written statements into the record may do so by submitting them to the committee clerk electronically in Microsoft Word format by 5 p.m., 14 days after the date of this hearing, which is May 15, 2024. And without objection, the hearing record will remain open for 14 days to allow such statements and other extraneous material referenced during the hearing to be submitted for the official hearing record. I now turn to the introduction of our witness. Today we have as our witness Acting Secretary Julie Su from the U.S. Department of Labor, located in Washington, D.C. We thank you for being here today and look forward to your testimony. I'd like to remind the witness that we have read your written statement, which will appear in full in the hearing record. Pursuant to Committee Rule 8D and committee practice, I ask that you limit your oral presentation to a 5-minute summary of your written statement. I also want to remind the witness to be aware of her responsibility to provide accurate information to the committee. I now recognize Acting Secretary Su.
Chairwoman Fox, Ranking Member Scott, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today on President Biden's fiscal year 2025 budget request for the Department of Labor. As the Acting Secretary of Labor, I get to travel the country to meet with workers. Workers like Mariah, a single mom who was living paycheck to paycheck, worried about how she was going to get by. She went to her local social services office to apply for Medicaid and SNAP benefits, and that's where she saw a flyer for a job training program in the pipe trades. Today, Mariah is in a good union job, and she has quadrupled her income. What struck me about Mariah was not just how much a good income meant to her, it was the pride she felt in putting in a hard day's work and getting rewarded for it, and the pride that she saw in her children's eyes. It's undeniable. Good jobs change lives. Our $13.9 billion budget request will help more people like Mariah get good jobs that can support families, lift up communities, and bring the dignity and pride that are core to the American dream. I want to frame our request under two priority areas. First, pathways to good jobs for all of America's workers. I've met with thousands of workers like Mariah who are in programs that work, programs that exist because we have invested in them. That's why we're requesting investments to develop and expand proven models to connect workers to the good jobs they want and need, and employers to the workers that they want and need. For example, we're requesting $8 billion for the Career Training Fund. That investment would help as many as 750,000 people who do not see four-year college as their path enroll in evidence-based, high-quality training programs for actual jobs in their communities. Workers who complete high-quality programs don't end up with a job search. They end up with a good job. We also seek $335 million for apprenticeship programs. Registered apprenticeships provide training for the actual skills that employers need. They allow workers to earn while they learn, and they increase job pathways for underrepresented groups, including women, people of color, veterans, and individuals with disabilities. When I talk to business owners, many tell me that their top concern is recruiting and retaining workers. Well, the investment in our budget requests are how Congress and the Department of Labor can tap into the talents and skills of all of America's workers and make sure that the supply of skilled workers meet the demand right now and well into the future. The second priority I'd like to highlight is the Department of Labor's mission to protect workers, including and especially those most vulnerable to exploitation. Too often, employers who hire 13-year-olds to work in hazardous conditions, fail to pay overtime for a 60-hour work week, or who put workers at risk of losing their limbs or even their lives on the job, do it because they believe they'll get away with it, that no one will stop them, that they can operate in blatant disregard of the laws that Congress has passed. Not on our watch. That's why we're requesting modest but important increases for the department's worker protection agencies, because we can't do this vital work without dedicated public servants, the wage and hour investigators who combat child labor, the team that ensures workplaces are free from safety hazards, the benefits advisors who answer the phone when panicked patients have been denied coverage for mental health services by their health insurance company. We're asking for $7.5 million for additional staff to combat wage theft and child labor, an additional $23 million to investigate high-hazard workplaces, protect whistleblowers, and give employers compliance assistance, and an additional $10.7 million for my solicitor's office, which has been essentially flat-funded for more than a decade. The President's request would also help us advance worker rights and promote a level playing field internationally for U.S. workers and businesses. And it would better support implementation of Congress's Secure 2.0 Act, the Mental Health Parity and Addiction Equity Act, and the No Surprises Act. Because when you pass laws, we should make them real. In all, this budget request will help make sure that workers can come home safe and healthy at the end of the workday and get high-quality jobs with the power to truly change lives. Again, I thank this committee, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Under Committee Rule 9, we will now question the witness under the 5-minute rule. I ask members to keep your questions succinct so the witness has time to answer within your 5-minute allotment. And I want to respond briefly to the ranking member's comments about the department responding in a timely fashion. It is really clear that our standards on what is a timely response is very different from the ranking member's standard on what's a timely response. Also, our standards for what composes a complete response is very different from what the ranking member believes is a complete response. We got 19 hours before this committee hearing a tranche of material we had asked for months ago. We got it last night. I'd also like to provide notice to the ranking member that I intend to serve a subpoena to the acting secretary if we do not receive by May 6th the department's return to office plan, which the White House Chief of Staff instructed each agency to prepare and submit by January 26th. You don't even follow your own lax requests by your own Chief of Staff. And this committee requested on March 6th. I now recognize the ranking member. Where are they? Yep. Thank you. Acting Secretary, after months of committee oversight, the Central States Pension Fund returned $127 million in taxpayer money it accepted when the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation paid it to fund dead Teamsters pensions. As Acting Secretary of Labor, you're the chair of the PBGC board. This allowed DOL to be involved in PBGC's decision-making. What role did you and DOL play in PBGC's original outrageous decision not to attempt to recover these overpayments?
There was never a point where there was not an attempt to recover the payments. Basically, let me just state 4 points. The first is that there were no monies paid to anybody who shouldn't have received it. The second is that, as you know, I think the money has been returned. The third point is that the PBGC has taken steps to make sure that all of the records that are submitted.
But you're not telling me what role you played.
So what we've played is, this is a little bit technical, so bear with me for a moment. When the money goes to the central states, the central states have a fiduciary duty over that funds. The Department of Labor issued analysis that allowed.
We're not interested in the processes that went on. We want to know, and I'll submit this as a question, and you'll need to answer specifically what you did in terms of getting back taxpayer dollars.
Well, but I can answer that. We submitted.
No, I have other questions I'd like to ask now. In September and again in November, Chairman Good and I wrote to you expressing concerns about the Employee Benefits Security Administration's failure to conduct its investigations in a timely manner. The department's responses did not provide full answers to our questions. Therefore, I'm asking you here and now, can you tell the committee how old EBSA's investigations are?
Well, our investigations, the timeline depends on the complexity of the cases. There's not a statutory timeline based in the reality that some cases are much simpler than others. Some cases involve there's much larger plans.
So I understand that, but you're the supervisor. So what have you done personally to ensure that they're closed in a timely manner? All of our offices have to deal with this kind of thing. Where do you step in to see this is long enough, let's get this settled?
Well, one of the things that you're highlighting, Chairwoman, is the importance of our budget request. One of the challenges we have is that we have far more cases.
Sorry.
And we need
investigators.
investigators.
As long as people are only coming in 5 days and 2 weeks, that isn't going to fly with me. Bring people back into the office. Then you could come and talk to us about more money. People aren't working. So I want to know, will you commit to providing the aging reports on every outstanding EBSA investigation on a monthly basis? We want to know where you are. We have our oversight responsibility. We need to know where you are with these aging reports.
I mean, Chairwoman, I just want to, as the ranking member said, I want to note that we have responded to oversight letters, and I do take your oversight responsibility very seriously. You've mentioned that you also want to make sure that we are responding to acknowledge when we get requests. My team does do that. It's very common for us to respond within minutes or hours of getting a request.
What you're sending doesn't answer our questions. Let me go on to another question. I understand you're interested in expanding apprenticeships, and I want to remind you that apprenticeships do not exist without employers willing to participate. The department's nearly 800-page proposed regulatory overhaul of the registered apprentice system is chock full of new mandates on employers. Can you name a single burden or existing requirement on apprenticeship sponsors that you remove in the proposed rule?
Well, one of the things that the proposed rule seeks to do, Chairwoman, is align high school programs and CTE better with apprenticeship programs, because we are seeing both a demand for workers and a desire among young people and a need to open up opportunities for more young people. So that's one of the goals.
I want to be a good role model, so I'm going to end my questioning. I will send you a specific question on that and give you a chance to give me a specific response. I now recognize Mr. Sablon for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Good morning and welcome, Acting Secretary Sue. I want to first thank you for your unwavering commitment. This is your second appearance here, I understand. Even as Republicans block your confirmation. Thank you also for addressing the concerns I raised last year regarding delays in processing temporary labor certificates, certifications for businesses seeking Mariana's only transitional worker visas. We're entering the application season now, and processing time are on time. Thank you and your department and your staff for that. The Marianas does continue to have a need for foreign workers, but during my time in office, we have worked to minimize that dependence, and we are seeing that dependence come down, but the need still exists. And one way to ensure that there are sufficient U.S. workers for our economy is through apprenticeships. So let me ask, your department has calculated that for every $1 an employer invests in a registered apprenticeship program, they get $1.44 back. That's a very good return. Unfortunately, in the territories, in the insular areas, in the outlying areas as called in this committee, only those with more than 100 apprenticeships are eligible for federally funded support these registered programs, and with our small populations. So I'd like to ask you and get your commitment that we could work with your Office of Apprenticeship to see what this requires. I appreciate that.
Yes, Congressman, thank you so much for each of those comments. If I may first start with thank you for acknowledging the department and my staff who have worked to make sure that the processes for something that you raised with me last time are actually working. I do feel the need to say that my staff of about 15,000 strong work very, very hard every single day to deliver for America's workers. Many of them work in the field to do it. Many of them are at places of employment doing investigations, and their work is incredibly important, and we should honor that. So thank you for your acknowledgement.
Madam Secretary, the compliment is my pleasure, because don't worry, we have pinged them in the past too, so they've come all of this way, and so I'm very happy with that. Thank you.
Thank you.
But so can I have your commitment that we will work with your Office of Apprenticeship, please?
Absolutely. And so to your point about registered apprenticeships, yes, the return on investment is very good. That is partly why we continue to invest in it as a proven model, and you absolutely have my commitment to work with you on this.
Thank you. Maintaining, again, this again is the Federal Employment Service Program. This committee recently succeeded in having the House pass H.R. 6655, a Stronger Workforce for America Act. This included my long-sought goal of including the Marianas in the Federal Employment Service Program, which helps place workers in jobs. Could you explain how this program works?
Yes.
For a small community with a great need.
So those programs are very important because what they do is help to connect job seekers to jobs and employers to the people that they need. There are services that include connecting people to training programs, recruitment, understanding of what skills are needed in certain communities. And so it's a really important part of our overall workforce system.
Thank you, Madam Secretary, Ms. Sue. And again, we need to ask your department to work with us and addressing the lack of workforce data in the insular areas to ensure that your promulgated rules, affecting overtime and exemptions and those things reflect the economic reality in each territory, because the department acknowledges it doesn't have that data at this time. It may take a while, but we start the work. I appreciate that. Ms. Sue, and thank you very much for your continued service. And I have other questions I may submit for the record.
Thank you. You have my commitment on that.
I am over my time.
Thank you, Mr. Sablon. Mr. Wilson, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chairwoman Virginia Fox, and I want to thank the Secretary for your service, and indeed, hey, we want you to be successful. But it really concerns me that the policies of the Biden administration of spend, borrow, tax have resulted in the highest inflation in 40 years, and that makes job creation that much more important, and that's why your position is so critical. And putting that in mind, too, the Biden executive orders, the regulations, the mandates, as cited by Chairwoman Virginia Fox, these destroy jobs. And so this has just got to be addressed. And on the topic of reclassification of independent contractors, and independent contractors are so important in our economy. I was an independent contractor myself in my life, so I know how important it is. The department has received several thousand public interest comments from independent workers raising concerns about the destruction of jobs from the new rule. However, the department chose to ignore many of the comments in the final rule by stating, quote, "The Department of Labor does not believe there will be any job loss from the new rule," end of quote. However, neither the rule nor the background materials produced by the department during the rollout for the final rule provides any backing as to the status of creation or destruction of jobs. What research do you have to support the department's jobs position?
Thank you, Congressman. So since President Biden came to office, we've seen over 15.2 million jobs created in this economy. At the same time, unemployment levels remain below 4% for the longest stretch since the 1970s. We also see real wage gains, especially for low and middle income workers, including gains that outpace inflation, which means that working people
Madam Secretary, the jobs created were ones to be that were actually we're below where we were, but the jobs created were in recovery from the COVID Wuhan virus. And so, but I'm particularly interested in independent contractors, and because hey, these are entry-level jobs, giving people an opportunity, and there's been no citing specifically of how this rule affects and justification for what is destroying jobs.
Well, respectfully, sir, we have not only recovered the jobs lost during the pandemic, we've exceeded that number. So the total job gains are not just more than it was when President Biden first came into office, but also it is faster than anybody predicted. And we've been able to do that in a way that doesn't sacrifice the well-being of workers, meaning unemployment has remained low, while labor force participation rate is also at an all-time high across just about every single demographic.
And Madam Secretary, I respectfully disagree. The jobs have not achieved where they were. The achievement of President Donald Trump of the lowest level of unemployment in history for African Americans, for Asian Americans, for women, for young people, has simply not been restored. And by having these new regulations and mandates, it's destroying jobs, destroying opportunities, particularly for entry-level employees. Another issue that's so important are H-2A adverse wage rates that have steadily increased in the last 10 years. And I continue to hear from the agricultural community in the district I represent that it's led to unsustainable and detrimental situation for them. And so what is your response to the agricultural community to say that the H-2A adverse effect wage rates are too costly or unworkable?
Thank you. That's a very important issue, so thank you for giving me a chance to talk about it. This department, we issued a rule about the adverse effect wage rate because the purpose of the H-2A program is to make sure that employers have the workers that they need, but at the same time that workforce does not undermine the working conditions and the job opportunities for U.S.-based workers. The specific question I think you're asking about is our rule about the adverse effect wage rate recognized that there were some occupations in which the wage rate was actually higher. But these were, some of them are heavy-duty operators. They are construction work in agriculture.
I look forward to working with you on that. And I will be, another question I want to get to you because my time is up, about H-2A, the rules on that make it almost impossible to terminate workers for cause. And some of these people are dangerous. And so putting fellow workers in danger. And so I'll be getting a question to you about the ability to terminate H-2A. So I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Wilson. Mr. Courtney, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman and Acting Secretary. It's great to see you here today, and thank you for your amazing service. Again, just to chime in a little bit on your last colloquy, in the state of Connecticut, we have roughly about 90,000 job openings. Our labor participation rate is above the national average. It's about 64% higher than during the Trump administration or during COVID for sure. And the way we clearly had realized that we have to sort of fill those positions is to close the skills gap. The Labor Department's Workforce Investment and Opportunity Act is hard at work right now. They graduated 935 metal trades folks last year down at our submarine shipyard that, again, that would not have happened if it wasn't for WIOA. We are also have WIOA programs in the healthcare sector. I was just with a group called CNA Boot Camp, where, again, it's a WIOA-funded 8-week intense program to get people trained and certified to fill all of the gaps that we have in nursing homes and hospitals. Immigrant population is probably the largest cohort that's benefiting from that program, Haitian community that we have in eastern Connecticut. And again, it's a really highly efficient, good return on investment in terms of job training dollars in an accelerated fashion to help deal with, again, what is still a lot of job openings in the economy. But that wasn't why I wanted to ask you about today, as I think you know. You came up and visited my district about 4 months or so ago and visited with the nursing community in the state there. Again, at the time, as you recall well, I'm sure, we lost a valuable, compassionate nurse who was a victim of workplace violence. She was stabbed to death on a home health visit with a very high-risk patient. Never should have happened. Again, OSHA has done an investigation. There is a penalty, but it's an after-the-fact and relatively meager amount in terms of the value of a human life that was there. The department's working on workplace violence prevention OSHA rule. Can you give us an update? And, obviously it's something that I think the entire healthcare profession is desperately looking for.
Yes, thank you, Congressman. And it was a pleasure to be in your district with you when we went to Three Rivers Community College and talked to people who both knew about that tragedy and who talked about the challenges in the profession. So we are working on a rule on workplace violence. We want to make sure that we go through every step, as we always do in our rulemaking. We have completed the small business review part of that process, and are working on the proposed rule, which will be coming out soon. Also, you mentioned the importance of OSHA and safety investigations. Obviously, we investigate cases after there are injuries or deaths, but to your point, the more we have a system in which employers are motivated to prevent those things from happening before they happen, that's obviously the ideal situation, and penalties that aren't seen as a cost of doing business are very important for that.
Thank you. And again, the folks that heard from you, we're totally convinced that your sincerity and commitment to doing this. One way Congress could help is for us to pass the Workplace Violence Prevention for Healthcare, H.R. 2663, which has 165 bipartisan co-sponsors. It passed in the last Congress with over 240 votes in the House. And really one of the key things that it would do is it would accelerate this rule process so that we could get these protections in place quicker. That's exactly what Congress did during the AIDS crisis to get emergency rules through so that today people wearing gloves, disposable needles, all that flowed from the fact that Congress acted to accelerate those rules. Lastly, we have a bill in committee, the Federal Employees Worker Compensation Act, which would empower nurse practitioners and physician assistants under the Federal Workers' Compensation System to be able to evaluate patients and issue reports that could be connected to benefits. Can you talk about the department's position on that measure?
Yes, thank you, Congressman. So one of the things that we have seen is that a lack of adequate medical professionals to evaluate those federal workers' compensation claims is a problem. We have tried to address it. We've increased the number by about 20%, but it remains a challenge. So I very much am anxious to welcome the opportunity to work with you on that proposal.
Great, thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Courtney. Mr. Wahlberg, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. And thank you, Acting Secretary, for being here today. I want to follow up on my friend and colleague from Connecticut relative to the H.R. 618 legislation that we've offered to enable nurse practitioners and physician assistants to be able to practice with under FECA, which hasn't been updated since 1974. That's when I was married. And in those 50 years, I've had to update myself over those years to make sure I made it to the 50th wedding anniversary soon. So I would hope you would support us with that legislation to update FECA so we can add to, in an evolving situation in healthcare, these component parts that can do a great job. So I have your commitment on that.
Yes, thank you very much, Congressman. Like I said, we've definitely identified that also as a challenge in the system that creates problems for people who are seeking workers' compensation claims. So I absolutely have my commitment to work with you.
Let me move to two issues here that have very similar concerns. First being the overtime rule question. As you know, DOL recently published its overtime rule, which unfortunately attempts to revive policies from the 2016 rule that the courts threw out. They threw out for being arbitrary and capricious, and specifically the rule seeks to impose automatic updates to the overtime threshold every 3 years, a policy which a witness at our Workforce Protection Subcommittee hearing testified would likely violate the Administrative Procedure Act, because this would not allow for notice and comment on the updates. The fiduciary rule question is almost the exact same. Along the same lines of previous invalidated rules, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit found that the 2016 fiduciary rule exceeded DOL's authority. The Department recently finalized fiduciary rule would cover the same sales practices as the 2016 rule. So I guess I have the same question for both those issues, the overtime rule and the fiduciary rule. Why do you expect that the courts will view the 2024 rules on these two issues differently than they ruled before when they threw it out?
So, Congressman, in the process of making the rules, we did engage in the process of, we had listening sessions, we had an open comment period, we responded to and took into account all the different comments.
But did you check the court record on it?
Yes. So we are very confident that the rules not only are within our authority, but that they take into account the existing case law about why the prior rules were struck down. And so,
why would these be any different? The sales rule and the fiduciary rule, is in violation.
So I don't know how much you want me to get into the details of each rule, but they are they take into account what the court said about why the prior rules could not stand, and they're different. The retirement security rule, for example, is the definition of a fiduciary is different. What is covered under it is different. I mean, it does.
Well,
trust me, Congressman. We want to make sure that when we go through
I don't read it that way at all, and I don't know how the court will read it that way at all. So I guess we wait and see. But otherwise, it's wasted time. It's concerning for the industries themselves when we're going back and doing something that, I mean, the uncertainty that goes on relative to these two rules, the slap back and forth. But in these two cases, the court determined it. So let me move to another one.
I mean, Congressman, I have a
independent
simpler
contractor,
answer.
direct seller issues of concern. The Department of Labor's independent contractor rule will have a devastating impact on the ability of millions of Americans to engage in flexible work in the modern economy. At the Workforce Protection Subcommittee hearing in February, I asked Wage and Hour Division Administrator Jessica Lohman about the clarity that would be provided under the rule to industries such as real estate agents and direct sellers who are specifically classified as independent contractors under the Internal Revenue Code. Ms. Luneman expressed commitment to developing guidance and resources to assist these legacy independent contractors in compliance. And so has the Small Entity Compliance Guide or Frequently Asked Questions document been reflected to provide this clarity, and is there any update on outreach to stakeholders?
So, Congressman, one of the most important roles of the Department of Labor is to make sure that working people in this country are protected. Our rulemaking is a part of that. To your prior question, I had an easier answer than retirement security, which is in the overtime threshold. That threshold is lower than it was in the 2016 rule. But when it comes to our outreach and compliance assistance, this is a
My
very
time has
important part
expired
of our
and we'll
work.
have to submit the question. Thank you.
If you would submit your question, Mr. Wahlberg, to get an answer. Ms. Bonamici, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Acting Secretary Sue. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your work, and thank you for your testimony. Thank you also for visiting Northwest Oregon. Really appreciate your visit, all the visits that we did and the sites that we visited where we talked about the work that you're doing to prepare workers, to protect them, their health and their rights, and to empower them with a voice on the job. One of the things we talked about during your visit was really emphasizing the importance of workforce development opportunities and having that path to a good job, how important that is, and the partnerships that are so critical. Partnerships between businesses, education, training programs that are really key to the success of these programs. So while you were in Oregon, we visited Portland Community College's Mechatronics Lab, which is partnered with state-based employers, including Intel, to offer programs like the Quick Start Semiconductor Technician Training Program, and also the Hillsborough Advanced Manufacturing Apprenticeship, where we're seeing some great paths to good jobs These sector strategies are really important for prospective workers to enter and succeed in the workforce. So I'm glad to see that the President's proposed budget will invest in the department's new sector program, the Sectoral Employment Through Career Training for Occupational Readiness, so sector program, to support these evidence-based partnership models. So this is a program that I proposed along with Representative Susie Lee in our Community-Based Workforce Development Act. So Acting Secretary Sue, will you tell us a little bit more about the benefits of that sector program and its goals for the upcoming year? And importantly, if you could describe the potential if it's fully funded.
Yes, thank you so much, Congresswoman. And I was delighted by our time together, and also to be able to put in place programs that you've envisioned, because you have seen firsthand how important it is for workforce training programs to be aligned with the needs of employers in a community, and to be able to bring all the pieces of the workforce system together so that, as I said in my opening, a job training program doesn't end in a job search, it ends in an actual job. So that the skills that somebody learns are actual skills that they're going to need for the job. So that the educational system, including community colleges, are aligned with all of that, and so that we are recruiting from and making available these training programs to all communities, including those who have been shut out of good opportunities in the past. So the sector program is precisely about that, looking at growing sectors, growing industries, recognizing that in this moment of historic job growth and opportunity, we should be creating training programs that align with industry needs. Right, and that's the way to create the most opportunity, and that industries and employers coming together to say, here's the skills that we need, and then training programs for that are the best way to build, what I often call an infrastructure for the workforce system that matches the physical infrastructure that we're trying to build.
Appreciate it. Well, I look forward to working with you on that program, and I certainly do hope it's fully funded. So I also wanted to ask you about heat stress. We're experiencing more extreme weather events, extreme heat. We had a heat dome in Oregon that was devastating, and many people lost their lives. And that means we need OSHA to issue a standard on heat to protect workers, both indoor and outdoor settings. And without a standard, workers continue to be at risk of serious or even fatal illness. There are some estimates that show that there could be as many as 170,000 heat-related occupational illnesses, and every year, including up to 700 fatalities. So what is the status of this important and life-saving effort?
Yes, thank you, Congresswoman. It is a very important effort that we have, because heat has become an occupational hazard. It is something that, people lose their lives on the job when there are relatively common sense measures that could be taken to prevent that from happening. So we are working on what would be the first nationwide standard for heat, indoor and outdoor heat, to prevent exactly those kinds of tragedies from happening. We are in the midst of that work now. We are engaging with the small businesses, as we are both required to do and is important to do, and we expect to put out a notice rule also later this year.
So any chance of anything before the heat comes in this summer?
I mean, what people often complain about is how long the rulemaking process takes. Part of the reason it takes a long time is that we do have to be thoughtful. We have to engage with all the stakeholders. There's a lot of pieces to making sure that a rule is thoughtful, is consistent with our authority, and is going to have the impact that we want it to have.
And I'll mention some states have already taken action. We really need a national strategy. And my time has expired, but thank you again for your testimony and for your work. And
thank you, Congressman. We will continue to do the enforcement to make sure that workers are healthy and safe on the job. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Bonamici. Mr. Grossman, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Department of Labor refers to registered apprenticeships as the gold standard of work-based learning. As you know, there are currently 3,500 apprenticeship models registered under the competency-based model. Do you believe these competency-based registered apprenticeships are good programs?
I'm sorry, Congressman. You were saying, are what programs good programs?
We're talking about registered apprenticeships, okay? Do you believe competency-based registered apprenticeships are good programs?
So thank you, Congressman, especially because your state has been such a leader when it comes to registered apprenticeships. And we have a $1 million state apprenticeship expansion grant in Wisconsin to help build the infrastructure to make sure that registered apprenticeships can thrive and employers can get what they need and working people in your state can get opportunity. I believe that registered apprenticeship programs are the gold standard. They provide for earn while you learn so that people who can't afford to just stop earning in order to train can actually get into training programs. They provide for a good job at the end. They provide for wage progression and other protections for skill standards. And we are seeing across the country right now, again, especially because of the historic investments that are being made in construction, in infrastructure, in clean energy, in manufacturing, that there's a need for good, reliable, tested job training programs, and registered apprenticeships are one of the best examples we have of that.
Your department, and I'm going to ask you, what was the basis for your department issuing a proposed rule that eliminates the successful competency-based model for registered apprenticeships, a model that's been referred to the bread and butter of apprenticeship expansion and will constitute more than 1/3 of the overall growth in the apprenticeships in the next decade, according to labor's own projections?
Again, Congressman, just in this administration, the Department of Labor has invested over $445 million in apprenticeship programs across the country. I believe in programs that are tested, that have support so that workers are actually going to end up in the job that they're training for, and that have real standards, in part because the standards in registered apprenticeships also give working people a chance to work in the job that they get, but also continue to grow in it. So registered apprenticeships are a model that have shown they're tested over time and really have been a pathway into the middle class for many American workers.
Okay, Wisconsin's a big manufacturing state. We're actually percentage-wise biggest manufacturing state in the country. 20% of our workforce is in manufacturing. When I meet with industry leaders, they cite workforce issues such as attracting and retaining skilled employees as their biggest challenge. The Biden administration's Department of Labor has proposed increasing the overtime salary threshold by about 70%, which would subject millions of currently salaried workers to overtime laws. So instead of increasing pay, the proposed rule would cause employers to shift millions of salaried workers to hourly workers, eliminating the remote and flexible work options and potentially resulting in fewer work hours, irregular paychecks, and lower overall compensation. Would you comment on the negative consequences of the big increase in the overtime salary threshold, how you believe that's going to affect American industry?
So, Congressman, there's nothing about the rule that would require that outcome. The reason why we did an overtime rule was because it's really important for working people to get a fair day's pay for a hard day's work. And our overtime rule helps to ensure that working people who work on a salary basis have more money in their pockets. A couple decades ago, the overtime threshold covered over 60% of working people. In the last administration, the threshold was set to a point where it was less than 10%. And so the overtime protections have been eroded over time because of that threshold. And that is why we undertook a rulemaking process to make sure that, that the threshold combined with the duties test that is the heart of protecting salaried employees when it comes to overtime remained real.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Grothman. Dr. Adams, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Acting Secretary Sue, for testifying before the committee again. I had the pleasure of attending a roundtable with you in Charlotte back in March, and I really appreciated your being there, but also admired how much attention you pay to the concerns of ordinary workers. So can you tell me more about the efforts that your office makes to hear from workers on the ground, and how your meetings with workers across the country have informed your budget requests?
Well, thank you for that, Congresswoman, and thank you for our time together in your district. Just to give an example from that, we got to visit an organization called She Built This City. I love the title of it. And the idea was to recruit from communities, especially women and women of color, who might not see themselves in some of the jobs that are being created, and to give them the basic exposure to using tools, to what it would be like to work on a construction site, to meet with others who have those jobs so that they could see themselves in those opportunities as well. And those kinds of interactions are incredibly important to me as the acting labor secretary. I think our policies, our enforcement priorities, and our budget requests all have to be informed by the real needs of working people. And everywhere I go, there are working people who are looking to find their pathway into the middle class, their shot at the American dream, and our workforce investments are meant to help create those connections. And sadly, I meet with too many workers who report that wage theft is a regular experience. Workers who say that they work in jobs where injuries are common, but when somebody gets injured, they get fired. And so they're the ones who are punished, and that also deters workers from reporting. I've met with workers who are working on a salaried basis, a single mother recently who told me that our overtime rule is going to put another $1,000 a month in her pocket. That is going to make a very big difference for her and for her children, which will also make a very big difference in her community. And so being able to hear from workers, to understand what they need to get outside of these buildings and even outside of Washington, D.C., is a privilege for me, so that in my role and in the department's important role, we can make sure that we are being really responsive to what workers need. I also meet with employers on a regular basis and understanding what employers who really struggle when there's not a level playing field, where the standards that they have to put in place in order to recruit and retain their workers are not being respected by their competitors is very challenging.
Let me move. I want to ask you a couple of other questions. So we've had some recent reports about the federal workforce funds that have been used to subsidize child labor violations. And, of course, Equus was one that found several children were found working in violation of labor laws. One of them was injured. So what tools are at your disposal, and what tools do you need to prevent WIOA funds from placing children in harm's way by firms that with records of child labor and health and safety violations?
That's a very important question, and it also ties to our budget request, because the reason why the child labor in that situation came to light is because our wage and hour division discovered it and exposed it and held that employer to account. And so having enough investigators on the ground in order to combat child labor is just critically important. Our budget request includes $5 million for that, and then $35 million overall for the wage and hour division to continue to combat wage theft.
Okay.
But on the point of WIOA, what we have done is, once we learned about it, we did let the local workforce board know about it and have been working with them to make sure that federal funds should never be used in a way that would condone or subsidize any kinds of labor law violations.
Thank you. Let me move on. Many opponents of DOL's retirement security rule have cited the National Association of Insurance Commissioners' best interest standard as a sufficient fix to the problem. Critics believe that the model rule renders DOL's rule unnecessary. But let me just ask you, could you explain some of the differences and why DOL's rule is necessary to ensure workers? Before I do that, we're just about out of time, but I do want to enter into the record, Madam Chair, the CFP Board's Code of Ethics and Standards of Conduct. I don't think I'm going to have time. If you can just send me a response to that question. Madam Chair, I'd like to enter this into the record.
Without objection, and we'll ask Ms. Sue to answer your question in writing.
Okay, thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Allen, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Fox. Secretary Sue, thank you for being, I'm right here, okay? Thank you for being here with us today. The DOL received a sizable number of comments on its fiduciary rule, even though the comment period was far too short. Many comments call for significant changes to the proposal, and many call for the proposal's withdrawal. DOL has emphasized that changes were made to the proposal based on the input it received. However, Assistant Secretary Lisa Gomez said in the New York Times there is nothing in these clarifications or changes that one should interpret as a watering down or a real change in the position of the proposal. Which is it? Were changes made to reflect stakeholder input on the rule, or was input ignored because DOL had already decided the desired outcome?
So, Congressman, putting aside the whether we ignored, I think that both things could be true, that we take into account comments, and we do. I could go through each of the rules that we have finalized, and we not only take comments, we also respond to all of the comments. And in many of the rules that we do...
Why did Ms. Gomez make this, are you familiar with Undersecretary Gomez's quote to the New York Times? I mean, in other words, this short comment period, it was there only to make it appear that there was no predetermined outcome on this, and yet, you have these comment periods to understand how these things are going to affect the business community out there. Let me move on. Georgia represents around 30,000 franchise establishments, and it represents over 315,000 employees. Recently, the National Labor Relations Board issued a final rule systematically reversing the course of what constitutes joint employer. This rule had previously cost franchises, small businesses, over $33.3 billion and a loss of 376,000 jobs. The last time you appeared before the committee, you did not provide a clear response as to whether the Department of Labor plans to issue a similar rule under the Fair Labor Standards Act. After almost a year, can you now commit to no rulemaking process as it relates to joint employer?
I believe last time I said that it was not on our regulatory agenda. I will repeat that again because it is still not on our regulatory agenda. As you know, the NLRB is a separate body, but the Department of Labor does not have such a rule on our proposals. I do just want to say, Congressman, that when it comes to our rulemaking, we do not approach it with predetermined outcomes. We take the comment period very seriously. You will see, I mean, I don't even know which rule to try to give an example of on this, but one way that you will see it is sometimes the timing of when rules go into effect are also based on the feedback we get, including from the regulated community, about what it would take in order to
Well, again, we have the information from the New York Times, which doesn't exactly match your what's going on there. I want to follow up on a line of questioning that I've not been able to get an adequate answer for almost a year now. When you testified in front of this committee last June, I raised my concerns about DOL's amendments to the Qualified Plan Asset Managers, the QPAM exemption, which would disrupt and unnecessarily burden workers and retirees' retirement plans who rely on QPAMs to manage the daily operations and investment of employee benefit plans. Unfortunately, when I brought this to your attention last year, I did not get a straight answer from you, and today I'm still trying to get a satisfactory response. Again, let me ask you, has the Department of Labor conducted a detailed and realistic cost-benefit analysis of its amendments to the QPAM exemption?
Congressman, I believe that rule has been finalized, and we always conduct a financial analysis of the impact of our rules when we do them. Our rules in that space are entirely meant to make sure that the retirement security of working Americans, which is often the largest savings that somebody has, often saved year after year, paycheck by paycheck, that is secure. And so we do analyses in all of our rules that are public. They're part of the public notice rule.
We need that information. And I have an additional question on apprenticeships. I'll submit that to you in writing. I'm out of time, and I yield back.
Pardon me. Ms. Jayapal, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Secretary Sue, I'm thrilled to welcome you here today. We are so lucky to have a lifelong champion for workers like you leading the Department of Labor, and you have really fought tirelessly for working people, especially the lowest wage workers in our country, domestic workers, immigrant workers, folks of color, but workers who are just trying to make it and deserve to be paid, no matter who they are, no matter where they are. In just the last year, President Biden and you have delivered tremendously for the American people. I have personally witnessed you helping break stalemates in labor negotiations and delivering critical protections for workers, longshore workers, healthcare workers, graduate students, research students in my district. You are very popular. I hope you come out and visit. I've also watched you deliver on a top priority of increasing the overtime threshold so that millions of workers ultimately get paid for the work that they are already doing, putting critically needed money in their pockets. It is a fact, it is truly a fact, that you and President Biden have presided over an incredible 39 straight months of job growth and 26 consecutive months of unemployment remaining below 4%. That is the longest stretch we have seen in over 50 years. Congratulations. I want to clear up a few things, and I'm hoping you can help me. Do you believe that bona fide independent contractors play a vital role in the U.S. economy and deserve a place within it? Just a yes or no is fine.
Yes, of course, Congresswoman.
And do you, Secretary Sue, does the department's final rule on misclassification prohibit people from entering bona fide independent contractor relationships in any way?
Absolutely not. It does not.
And doesn't the rule just simply restate the existing case law?
Yes, it restores decades of case law on how to determine whether someone is an independent contractor or an employee.
Does it in any way prohibit flexibility?
It does not.
So it seems to me that this rule simply ensures that workers are not unlawfully denied a century of labor protections because a business decides to label them as, quote, independent contractors when in fact they are employees. Is that correct, Secretary Sue?
That is correct, Congresswoman, and we see that, right? We see dishwashers in restaurants called independent contractors. We see workers on construction sites called independent contractors. It's both very harmful to working people who should have the protections of minimum wage, overtime, unemployment insurance, and the like. But it's also it makes it very difficult for businesses who play by the rules to compete and to thrive.
Thank you. You talked about the investments in workforce training, and just yesterday I was in front of my Chamber of Commerce. They were visiting, and I heard the same desperate plea for those kinds of investments in workforce training. One area that you know I've focused a lot on is the area of care work, the care economy and domestic workers. I'm very proud to be the House sponsor of the Domestic Workers Bill of Rights. There are 2.2 million domestic workers who care for our children, elders, people with disabilities, and our homes. They do the work that makes all other work possible. And despite the essential nature of their work and the high demand that we have for the workforce, domestic workers have long been excluded from the basic protections of the Fair Labor Standards Act, and they're amongst the lowest paid, with nearly 90% getting no benefits at all. Do you agree that we in government have an essential role to play to eradicate these exclusions and ensure that protections for domestic workers, such as those in the Federal Domestic Workers Bill of Rights, are enacted into law?
Congresswoman, thank you so much for your leadership in that space. As you know, President Biden has also called for investments in our care economy. all of you in the American Rescue Plan Act made sure that there were investments that helped to keep about 225,000 child care facilities open when the pandemic was still, in 2021 and 2022. And those investments help to increase child caregiver wages as well. So it's a recognition that we should not have to choose between affordable, reliable care and the well-being of those care workers. And so I would be delighted to work with you in any way to make sure that those twin aims are met. And it's something that, again, the President has been very clear about, as have you, and I really appreciate how much you have raised the importance of the issue.
Thank you so much for your commitment to American workers everywhere. I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Jayapal. Mr. Thompson, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman. Acting Secretary, as you know, I've co-chaired the Bipartisan Career and Technical Education Caucus for more than a decade. Since that time, with the help of critical investments from the Strengthening Career and Technical Education for the 21st Century Act, I championed in the 115th Congress, we've made tremendous strides in helping students of all ages access these high-quality, affordable programs. Ones that lead to certificates, to in one hand, diplomas in one hand, quite frankly, multiple job offers in the other. I'm very concerned, however, with your department's proposal to expand federal control over successful CTE programs through the regulatory concoction that you're calling CTE apprenticeships. Obviously, we're both very supportive of CTE and apprenticeships, but I've not heard from a single student, employer, or program who thinks it is necessary to combine the two. Just because each of these are successful on their own does not mean the Department of Labor should have any role in enforcing them together through regulation. Now, I have significant concerns with your proposed rules, as do many CTE advocates across the spectrum, including state Perkins agencies and national advocacy associations. So question number one, did the department engage with CTE stakeholders in the development of this proposed rule? And if so, how was their input and feedback incorporated into the proposed rule?
Thank you, Congressman. It's actually a pleasure to meet you. I share your interest in how we make sure that our training programs are leading all communities into actual jobs. That is why there is a $1.5 million grant in your district for our Workforce Opportunities in Rural Communities grant, something that we created in this administration, recognizing that when we talk about equity and making sure everybody is included, we have to make sure that our rural communities are not left behind. Our rule and all of our policies are not intended to limit the operations of CTE programs or registered apprenticeship programs. It's our hope is to actually braid together more connectivity where it's needed. Again, so that we're not creating training programs that aren't connected to actual jobs at the end of them. That's been a long time criticism of the workforce development system. And in this administration, we have leaned in very hard on, especially, again, because of the historic job growth that we are seeing.
Yeah.
Many jobs that do not actually require a four-year college degree, these programs become even more important.
We couldn't agree more that there needs to be multiple pathways to success. But under the old adage, if it's not broken, don't fix it. And when I visit career and technical education programs today, there's no longer less enrollment. There's actually waiting lists. And schools are looking to add programs, adding capacity because of the interest. The proposed rule empowers your department to create, quote, industry skills frameworks, end quote. And that new CTE apprenticeships would have to adhere to. The Department of Education, which implements the Perkins Act, is explicitly prohibited from developing and imposing curriculum for CTE programs. You are violating the intent of Congress and law by doing what you're doing. Why is your department attempting an end run on this prohibition and seeking to dictate CTE curriculum without the authorization of Congress? And where does your department believe, what attorneys in some dark corner of the department, why do they believe this, where this authority comes from?
So, Congressman, I hope I don't say this wrong because I'm not 100% positive, but to your question about whether we have engaged with CTE providers and others in our rule, I believe the comment period might still be open, and if it is, then I would encourage your constituents to engage with us on the rule.
I would encourage constituents all across 435 districts to
your
engage
second
with
question,
feedback.
To your second question about I think that's about the Perkins Act, which is something that is under the purview of the Department of Education, not the Department of Labor. We do not seek to regulate or to change that.
Well, quite frankly, though, apprenticeships are a part of the Perkins Act. We strengthened within the Perkins Act, restored the power and the effectiveness of that. Let me move on to my last question. Over 30 states, including Pennsylvania, are currently recognized by the Department as state apprenticeship agencies and granted the authority to register and oversee apprenticeship programs in their state. Do you believe that the federal government understands the needs of employers and the specific occupational requirements in each of these states better than the state apprenticeship agencies?
No, Congressman, which is why many of the ways that we have approached our workforce funds have been to invest in creativity and partnerships and efforts that originate on the ground. And so we believe that employers, local workforce boards, local community-based organizations, unions, and other workforce partners who are invested in creating an effective infrastructure to connect people to good jobs and employers to people.
My time has expired, and I appreciate what you're saying, but it's counterintuitive and completely opposite of what you're doing, because your department is proposing a rule that would strip states and those wonderful state-level agencies you've talked about. It would strip of their ability to recognize and approve occupations that are eligible for registered apprenticeships, and you're forcing all programs to adhere to the one-size-fits-all. It's just a bad role. Thank you.
Ms. Stevens, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and it is such a delight to be in the presence of a phenomenal leader in this presidential administration and for the country. Ms. Sue, you have been at the Department of Labor during some of the most, pardon me, critical times in this country's economic, thank you, my colleagues are past me. All of a sudden I lost my voice. I've been sitting here for hours. Thank you. And hopefully I can go a little over, Madam Chair. No, I'm okay. I was just on the phone. But you've been at the Department of Labor during some of the most critical times in this country's recent economic trajectory. Record job growth during unprecedented challenge. And that needs to be recognized, as well as the symbolism of your leadership, which means so much not only to the workers of this country, but to women. And women who are being tried and stretched every step of the way, seeking daycare, managing 40-hour work weeks, and looking for a pay raise. And Ms. Sue, I'd like to start with a topic that is certainly on the minds of so many of my constituents, which is pension and retirement savings. We've seen pension risk transfers emerge as a method for companies to partner with insurance companies to manage some of their pension risk. As you know, in 2002, Congress asked the department to undergo a review of the regulatory standards surrounding the sale of PRTs, known as IB 95-1, which really hadn't been done since 1995. And I was just wondering if you could give us an update on the timing for when the department's report on IB 95-1 will be released.
Thank you so much, Congresswoman, and thank you for your comments. I think it's also worth noting, to your point, that under President Biden's leadership, the labor force participation rate for prime-age working women has reached an all-time high since this data was first collected, and especially coming out of a pandemic where women were so devastated by so many things, including the lack of infrastructure to support the responsibilities that women bear. Thank you for giving me a chance to say that.
And I know you can talk, too, about the transparency standards for companies engaging in PRTs, too.
So thank you for that. So at the Department of Labor, we regularly review our rules and regulations, as you know, to make sure that they keep up with the times. That's why, as I mentioned earlier, our overtime regulations, our retirement security rules, and our guidance on pension plan transfers. And so, as you note, a lot has changed since 1995 when our pension risk guidance was first put out. And so we are taking a look at that now. We're still in that review process, and I look forward to sharing our findings with you as soon as we
And we
complete it.
salute your efforts to protect the interests of pension holders who are just at the front and center in this labor market, and are certainly eager to see their hard-earned retirements be there for them. And also, we know that we have just been at a tremendous moment with regard to the 21st century labor movement and its proliferation. Michigan has been front and center. We were so delighted to see your boss not deliver from a podium or a large rally, but to stand there on a picket line. And I was just wondering if you could talk briefly about the value that labor organizations bring to the workforce to meet the needs of our cutting-edge economy.
Well, I think there's no better way to say it than what the president himself says regularly, which is that the middle class built America. He often says Wall Street didn't build it, although they're good guys too. But the middle class built America, and unions built the middle class. And that is in part why I'm very proud that we have a president who is presiding over a moment in which labor unions are organizing in ways that hasn't happened in some time, where the outcomes at the bargaining table are wins for workers and for their employers and for the industries that are represented, and where public sentiment about unions is at a historic high.
And you're certainly playing a role in making sure that unions have a seat at the table as we implement some of these very historic investments that the Democratic caucus was so proud to make alongside President Biden. An infrastructure bill, things that we're not blocking, that are delivering for the American people. A CHIPS Act, and certainly the Inflation Reduction Act as well.
Yes, thank you, Congresswoman. And the law says that workers should have a free and fair right to join a union, and the president believes that, and so do I. And the unions have provided opportunity and a middle class life for so many Americans, including, I've told this story before, but my parents both worked minimum wage jobs initially, and through the job that my mom got at a county in a union, it really helped to provide us with the middle class life that allows me to.
Thank you for your remarkable leadership. I yield back.
The gentlewoman's time has expired. Mr. Banks, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Acting Secretary Sue, your proposed apprenticeship rule cites the Advisory Committee on Apprenticeships' recommendations to justify its DEI policies, which say that some apprenticeship sponsors are, quote, are actively hostile to hiring minorities. Can you explain what that means, and do you agree that some registered apprenticeship programs are managed by racists? And if so, who are they?
So, Congressman, I believe that we have the opportunity in this country at this time, given the unprecedented investments that are being made in American industry, in American jobs, in what the president says all the time. We should be able to make things here, right? We invented semiconductors, and there's no reason why we can't be the ones to manufacture them.
I understand. I understand all that, but the committee's justification for the rule specifically says, quote, that some apprenticeship sponsors are actively hostile to hiring minorities. Does that mean that there are racist apprenticeship programs in our country?
Well, so I don't know specifically the quote that you're reading from, but let me just say
it comes from
that
the recommendations for the rules from your department.
Because of the opportunities that are being created right now, I think that there is no reason why we should not be able to tap into the full talent and ability and promise of every single American in every single community.
Fine.
And part of what has held people back from that,
though, what are the racist apprenticeship programs that we're talking about?
Well, part of what has held people back from being able to participate fully in American life and take advantage of the opportunities that should be available to everybody is discrimination.
It's a simple question. What are the racist apprenticeship programs in our country that you're referring to?
Well, I think that what we should be doing is both making sure that opportunity is broadly shared and our investments
I take it you don't want to answer that question, so I'll move on. The recommendations also say that registered apprenticeships have been, quote, the domain of white, able-bodied men. That's a direct quote from the recommendation from the committee in your department. Do you agree with that comment?
I don't know what you're reading from, Congressman. What I believe is that
I'm reading from the Advisory Committee on Apprenticeships biannual report to the Secretary of Labor, dated May 10, 2023, page 14, that is the justification for the rule, the new apprenticeship rule that justifies forcing DEI programs and mandates on apprenticeship programs. So I'm reading directly from something that comes from your department, and I'm asking if you agree with it. Do you agree with this statement that apprenticeships have been the, quote, domain of white, able-bodied men? Do you agree with that?
Sir, it sounds like you're reading from a report that was submitted to me.
You've quoted and used to justify the DEI programs and the rule. I mean, this is all coming from your department. I'm just asking if you agree. If you don't agree with this, say you don't agree with it.
What I believe, Senator, Congressman, is that we are a country.
I take it you don't want to answer the question. Let me ask you this a different way. Is having fewer white men in apprenticeships the goal of all of the DEI provisions in the proposed rule?
I'm sorry, say that again?
Is having fewer white men in apprenticeships the goal of the proposed DEI rules and mandates in the rule? Is that the goal, to have fewer white men in
Absolutely
apprenticeships?
not.
Okay. Will the department punish states that don't meet the proposed rules' racial quotas?
I mean, Congressman,
I have a good reason for asking that, because the proposed section 29.27B2 would require states to submit a strategic plan for increasing participation from underserved communities that include the current participation by each race and demographic group, and set specific targets for increasing participation for each race. So can you explain to me how that, would you or wouldn't you punish states that don't meet that and those racial quotas for apprenticeships?
I mean, Congressman, we have never gone wrong in this country when we have expanded opportunity to more individuals, to more communities, and to make sure that everybody gets to participate.
Punish states like Indiana that don't meet that mandate.
I don't even know what punitive scheme you are talking about. When we engage with employers, with workforce boards, with unions, with community-based organizations, these are all the stakeholders that I regularly engage with when I travel the country to talk about how we're going to help meet the workforce needs of employers and the desire to work of Americans of all communities, urban and rural, of all colors, women, individuals with disabilities, veterans. Our apprenticeship programs and our investments are meant to open up opportunity.
Read your own rule, your justification behind it. It's very offensive, I believe dangerous and un-American. With that, Madam Chair, I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. Ms. Manning, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Acting Secretary Sue, I would like to thank you so much for your many years of extraordinary service to our country. In response to remarks made at the top of this hearing, I'd like to clarify for the record that the prior president used the cabinet and cabinet-level jobs as a virtual temp agency, with 22 cabinet and cabinet-level officials who served in an acting capacity for a total of 2,736 days, including Acting Secretary of Defense, Acting Secretary of Homeland Security, Acting Secretary of the Interior, Labor, Veterans Affairs, Secretary of State, OMB, EPA, and Acting Chief of Staff, to name just a few. Our job here today is not to beat up on you for things that are beyond your control, but to find out how we can help solve the workforce shortages our employers are facing, how we can help protect workers, our constituents, who are taken advantage of by unscrupulous employers, and help those businesses that are doing the right things for their workers but have trouble competing with employers who cheat or abuse their employees. So I'd like to start by talking about wage theft. Wage theft occurs when employers don't pay the full wages due to their employees. This includes paying workers less than minimum wage, not paying overtime to workers who work more than 40 hours a week, or asking employees to work off the clock before or after their shifts, and we know this happens. So do you have an estimate of the total amount of U.S. Department of Labor, total amount the U.S. Department of Labor has recovered on behalf of workers due to wage theft?
I do. Thank you so much, Congresswoman, for that. So in FY23, we recovered $156 million in wages for working people. And it's worth noting that the overwhelming amount of those wages come from unpaid overtime wages.
So over the last several years, the wage and hour division's total enforcement staff has declined. This has resulted in fewer on-site investigations, yet my colleagues across the aisle are proposing significant cuts to that division. Can you explain why it's important to have funding necessary to put boots on the ground to ensure workers are being paid what they're owed?
Yes, Congresswoman. I mean, oftentimes the Department of Labor's enforcement is the first and last line of defense, especially for workers who do not have the benefit of a union, who do not have other ways of protecting themselves against wage theft. Now, it's worth noting that the vast majority of employers are trying to do the right thing. They have a business model in which they are supportive of their workers and understand why investing in their workers is the best investment that they can make. Those employers also need strong enforcement to ensure that there is a level playing field for them to compete on. And so if we do not have adequate resources to investigate, and even as it is, we're thoughtful and smart and strategic about how we devote our resources. We don't investigate every employer. We don't need to. We shouldn't. We shouldn't investigate anybody who's in full compliance with the law. But even there, the wage theft that we see, the child labor that has grown, we need to have the resources to be able to combat
So let
those.
me move to the child labor issues, because we've really seen an explosion in child labor abuse cases in the last decade. And again, you're addressing this problem with record low numbers of staff in the wage and hour division, and also a resource-starved solicitor of labor office. What are the effects of your ability to enforce with less staff, and how would proposed cuts harm this mission?
Right. I mean, it's really horrific, the kinds of child labor cases that we are uncovering. We're talking about 13-year-olds working on the kill floor of a meatpacking plant on the overnight shift with dangerous chemicals. We're talking about a 16-year-old who recently lost his life working as a sawmill operator. I mean, these are jobs that are dangerous and illegal for children to be doing. We're not talking about a young person learning how to show up on time and do a good job and deal with customers in a job that is appropriate for a young person. And so our ability, children working on roofs, I mean, our ability to be clear that when employers engage in those practices, that they cannot just consider it, the chance of getting caught to be slim and the consequences if they do get caught to be minimal. We have to change that calculus, and having a strong investigative capability is really important to that.
Thank you. My time has expired, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Manning. Mr. Good, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Secretary Sue, from your official Twitter account 29 days ago on April 2, you tweeted or X'd, if your boss says everyone at work is like family, you might need a union. Do you think it's a negative thing to treat people like family at work?
No, I do not.
So you would say
Congressman.
that treating people like family at work is a good thing or a positive thing, or you think that's a negative thing?
I think that treating people with dignity, with respect.
I want to ask do you think that treating people like family at work is a good thing or a bad thing?
I think that
I'd like you to say it's a good thing or a bad thing.
I think all working people should be treated with dignity and respect, and that the laws that protect them should be complied with.
So you would say treating them like family does not accomplish that?
No, I think
but your response was, if your boss says that, let me quote again, if your boss says everyone at work is like family, you might need a union. Why would that be?
I think that all working people deserve a just day's pay for a hard day's work.
So if you're
Need to
treating
be
them,
able to-
and if you have a workplace culture that's like family, I don't know if you ever visited small businesses or not, if you've ever been around a small business where they have long-time employees, they have a family-like atmosphere, they like it there, they want to work there, they've worked there a long time, they're building retirement for themselves and so forth, and they say, hey, this is like a family atmosphere here. You would say that's a negative thing, they need to be rescued by a union?
I would not. I mean, my parents
Okay, so you
had-
don't agree with that tweet? You don't agree with what you said?
Well, my parents had small businesses growing up, and we, what I learned from them was that you should always treat your workers the way that you would want to be treated.
And I would suggest that treating them like family meets that threshold better than anything else. Let me ask you another.
But if I could,
I'm going to change
Congressman, I think
subject. I'm going to
sometimes-
change subject,
Okay.
please. Do you think why should not every federal employee come to work in person every day?
Well,
Why should not every federal employee show up to work every day?
first, I do want to say again, because any suggestion to the contrary is both non-factual and I think highly offensive, that the
Should every federal
employees of
employee
the
show up
Department
to
of
work
Labor
every day?
have been working
Should every federal
hard
employee show up to work every day?
through incredibly difficult circumstances and without all of the resources that we need, which is why we come with this budget request.
So you proposed a recent policy change that instead of reporting 2 days a week, we're going to report 5 days a week to work instead of 2 days a week. That's what you reported. That's your new rule, supposedly, for the Department of Labor that's not even been implemented yet because they are literally protesting showing up to work. And I'll tell you, I hope you've seen the irony in this. On March 19, a group of Department of Labor employees showed up in person. See the irony there. They showed up in person to a federal building in Boston, not to work, mind you, but to protest the proposed plan to show up to work 50% of the time. So they wouldn't show up in person to work. I don't know why they didn't protest remotely, but they thought they needed to show up in person to protest having to come to work in person. Do you see the irony in that?
I mean, Congressman, I think it's not right to ridicule the hard work of federal employees.
Well, I would suggest that if they're not showing up to work, they may not be hardworking federal employees. Wouldn't you maybe agree with that?
Well, for example, many of my staff show up not to an office to work because that's not their job.
We agree on that.
Their
Many of your
job
staff
is
do not show up in person to work. We agree on that.
That doesn't mean they're not showing up to work. I said show up to an office.
So you're going to suggest they work better when they're not in person?
I'm saying that some of
I can tell you our constituents would say they're not getting adequate and effective service from most federal agencies, especially since some 80% of them don't come to work, they don't show up to work. Our constituents have to show up to work. We choose to show up to work. Our constituents expect us to do that. But you think you're not even implementing your own rule. They have to show up to work 50% of the time.
I mean, Congressman, I do not believe that your constituents would be the ones who are getting federal workers' compensation claims, which we have continued to process and have cut down the timelines for doing so. I do not believe that your constituents are the ones who are relying on the Department.
This administration is trying to change the rules to make it harder to fire federal employees in anticipation of a new administration. Why would they do that? Why would they anticipate with a new administration they might need to protect federal workers from being held accountable and unperforming workers, maybe those who don't want to show up to work, by the way, that it might be easier to fire them? Why would this administration be fighting that in anticipation of a new administration?
I mean, Congressman, federal employees are civil servants. They're public servants. Most of them could do another job and get paid much more to do it.
They're not serving when they're not coming to work, and they're taking full advantage of 4-year-old COVID policies, I should say, and still not reporting to work every day. That's offensive to the people that they're supposed to serve. I yield back, Madam Chairman.
The gentleman yields back. I'd like to enter into the record without objection a correction of a statement made by the acting secretary earlier that the labor force participation rate is at an all-time high. That is not correct. According to the BLS, the labor force participation rate for March 2024 was 62.7%. In the past 10 years, the labor force participation rate reached its highest level under the Trump administration at 63.3%. We will enter the appropriate charts into the record. And with that, I recognize Mr. Norcross for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and
Thank you to our witness for coming here today. It's great to have you. A couple of things I'd like to talk about, but let's start with, should a worker who has active COVID show up for work at the workplace?
I don't think anybody who is sick and could get other people sick should show up to work, Congressman.
Okay. Just for the record, there were many members that didn't come to work during the pandemic that voted remotely, and some of those are in this room. Maybe we should go back and try to get their pay back, because they didn't show up for work either, according to some people. But that's just my view. It's not just the ones who are serving us here in Washington, but I remember seeing many of them back home sitting in their homes saying they're working. So it's a little ironic that this is now a big issue. But let's switch to something a little bit more important, at least the way I look at it, is registered apprenticeship programs. I think they're incredibly important, and I would suggest one of the most successful federal workforce programs in the history of our country. 93% of those people who complete a registered program are employed upon completion. That's pretty good. Average wage is $77,000. Yet I continue to hear about these unregistered programs. Madam Secretary, is there anything in the law that prevents a company from privately creating their own registered program?
Right. There's nothing preventing that, Congressman.
So at any time, any company can say, I'm creating this unregistered program, and do it. Nothing in the law. It's only when they want to receive monetary dollars or accreditation from the federal government that they have to follow those registered rules. Remember that. They can do it anytime they want. It's when they want us to give them the money that we're saying you must follow the rules. And let me give you a good indication why. There's something called Storm Break. It's the largest group of employers and employees in this world. When a hurricane, a tornado, natural disaster hits an area, it wipes out the power systems that the utilities provide. And something called mutual aid or Storm Break, people come from around the country. And what makes that work, because historically it used to be one of the most dangerous times for workers being killed, because people turn on electric, there's backfeeding from solar panels. A registered apprenticeship program allows this to happen, so that those who are being trained in California on the utilities are the same in New Jersey or the same in Florida. So we all come together understanding there's a certain way to do it. This is just one example of the value of a registered apprenticeship program. Can you talk to us where that is today? Is it now the law of the land to have registered apprenticeship programs?
So you are 100% right, Congressman, that employers can set up programs to train, to recruit, to retain, and call them apprenticeship programs as well. For me, what I see around the country in this moment is because of the jobs that are being created in communities all across America to rebuild roads and bridges, to make sure that every family has clean drinking water when they turn on the faucet, to make sure that every community has access to high-speed, reliable internet, to make sure that we're making investments in a clean energy and a future where everyone can breathe clean air. We are in a moment of tremendous job growth. And registered apprenticeship programs are helping to deliver the workers that are needed. And I talked about Mariah in my opening statement. It's not just having a worker fill a need, it's about a worker getting to do a job, getting to do it in a way that keeps themselves healthy and safe, that gets them, to learn a skill that they might not have had, and to start their job without debt and to continue to grow in that job and get what I hear from working people and people in apprenticeship programs all the time, a little bit of security, a little bit of what the president calls breathing room.
Thank you. I yield back the balance of my time.
The representative from Michigan, Ms. McClain, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for being here today. I want to talk about the independent contractor rule. What is the goal of that rule or that piece of legislation?
So, thank you for that question.
I'm sorry?
I said thank you for the question. The goal of the rule is under the Fair Labor Standards Act, employees are entitled to a host of protections, minimum wage, overtime, and others. The definition of who is an employee is important because independent contractors don't have those protections and employees do. So what we were doing with the rule...
But isn't that the choice of the employee?
Well...
So I'm still going back to, it, very simply put, what is the goal of the independent contractor rule?
The goal of the rule was to restore decades' worth of interpretation about who is an independent contractor and who is an employee.
And you think you're best suited to make that definition?
Well, let me say, Congresswoman, I didn't make up the test. When I say it comes from decades
then
of
I'm
case
still
law,
confused on what the goal of the rule is.
It was to...
Where's the problem? Seems to me like we're trying to fix a problem that doesn't exist.
Well, Congresswoman, misclassification is a real problem. Misclassification refers to
what is the problem? What is the problem? Because people have a choice.
Oh, well,
am I not mistaken?
I mean, here's an example.
No, I'm not looking for an example. I'm looking for an answer.
It's a problem if you are hired to do a job in which you should have all the protections of employee status.
Then go and don't be an independent contractor. Choose an employer. You can either be a 1099 or you can be a W-2. That's your choice, right? If I don't want to be an independent contractor, is there a law out there that says I can only be an independent contractor? The answer to that, because I know you're going to give a 20-minute dissertation, is no.
No,
so let me ask you this. Have you ever been a business owner?
I'll be brief about this. I will just say that for the many workers who have come to us and said, I wasn't paid what I should have been paid, and I was called an independent contractor.
But the confusion, stop, you're mixing apples and oranges. So I go and I'm an independent contractor. I know I'm an independent contractor. And then what's the problem? I mean, you know what you're doing. You're either an independent contractor or you're not. So what my biggest concern is you haven't even been able to clearly articulate what the goal of that rule is. I mean, we talk in circles. Do you believe in capitalism? Yes, wonderful. Have you ever owned a business?
I've said this before, and I'm sure I'm going to get cut off saying it now, but
Good.
I am the
that
daughter
would be a yes or a
of
no.
small business owners.
So that's great.
I'm
a daughter
when
too.
I was growing up.
So okay, this should be really easy for you. Let's try this again. Listen carefully. If you need to write a note down, that's fine. Have you? It is kind of comical when you're supposed to be the acting secretary and you can't answer a question. So I'm with you on the comedy. Unfortunately, it's not that comical because it's real life. So let's try it again. Have you, not the daughter, not the mother, not the sister, not the aunt, have you ever owned a business?
Congresswoman, you asked me why the
have
rule is
you,
important.
Okay, let's try this again. So you're making a ton of money. You're making legislation for business owners. You're supposed to be in charge as the acting person, yet you can't answer a simple question. Amazing to me. Maybe we should just pay you more money and that would help you answer the question. I'm going to go back to the question again. Have you ever owned a business? Not a trick question.
Congresswoman, there are working people in this country
yes.
who do not choose
this
to be
is the very reason why you can't get confirmed is because you can't answer a question, right? It's simple. I'll even accept an I don't know. Have you ever owned a business? And yes, I'm Congresswoman. So have you ever owned a business?
Working people in this country are entitled to basic protections under the federal law. It is our job as the Department of Labor.
So is that yes, you have owned a business, or no, that's not. I mean, you are brilliant at answering a question that I didn't ask. And this is the very reason why you can't get confirmed in the Senate, because nobody trusts you, because you can't answer a simple question. If you're supposed to be in charge, I would think it's not too much to ask to be able to answer a question. And with that, my disappointment continues to grow, and your smugness continues to be very unacceptable. But you continue being acting secretary, making policies of which you know nothing about. And with that, I yield back.
The representative from California, Mr. DeSaulnier, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Madam Secretary, Julie, I'm very, very proud of you as a friend and a colleague for many years, and as a former business owner who's made lots of payrolls. As much as I admire people who own businesses, it's not discovering the cure to cancer. So in that regard, I did want to talk to you specifically about the work you're doing that helps small businesses. When we enforce labor laws, when we make sure our workforce is protected, and again, as somebody who's been in the restaurant business, and my success was directly related to my employees, and making sure that I respected them and they respected me as an owner and a manager. A lot of what we're doing here is making sure that the underground economy and people who don't respect their employees, who don't pay them, who don't go by the law. We found out in California, actually, former Congresswoman Mimi Walters and I did an underground economy. I think you might have been there then, and just looked at how hard it was for business owners who complied with labor laws, amongst others, to compete with the underground economy, which at that time was about 25%. So we aggressively, in a bipartisan way, went about that. So a lot of the work you've done is actually not just in protecting the employees, but protecting high road employers, the Costcos of the world as opposed to the Walmarts of the world, I would say. So in that regard, a perfect example is something we worked on together, our staff and your staff, on the multi-employer pension. We, by doing what we did, no taxpayer money was expended. We saved retirement for 800,000 American workers. Let's see, 40,000 in Michigan, 40,000 in Ohio, 22,000 in Wisconsin. That was a real accomplishment. We really struggled with how we were going to save central states and make that hold. And one quote amongst the many, many stories we heard about individual Americans from gentlemen from Wisconsin: I saved and planned for my pension to help me pay my bills in retirement. I had a bad back and knees, and do not see a job I could accomplish after working for the trucking industry for years. My wife worked at public school and has a small pension which will not cover our bills. How do I get a job in my mid-70s, given that my retirement might go away? I worked long hours in terrible weather to earn my pension and thought I planned for my retirement and trusted it. I really worry about how we will survive with no pension. We saved that man's retirement. You did, your department and our committee. It's sort of surprising to hear the majority even bring this up, given the subcommittee work on this, where I would describe it as political malpractice of their assertions that dead people get paid and taxpayers paid for this. Could you respond a little bit more? You didn't have time to respond when the chairperson was asking you. This was a real success story, and it was a success story for small business. We estimated that up to 3,000 businesses, small businesses, would have gone bankrupt because of their obligations had we not done, and had you not done in your department, done the work you did.
Thank you very much, Congressman. That was a big accomplishment in making sure that working people who had saved their entire careers for retirement were able to actually have a secure retirement. As you noted, it was also very important for the employers who would have been stuck without real options and would have either gone bankrupt or had to try to get loans without the ability to do so. And so this was a real example of Congress coming together, certainly in partnership with President Biden, who has long been a champion of making sure that every working person who saves for retirement actually gets that retirement into their hands. I mean, this is about basic security the fact that some of that money came back from central states was actually, the process worked. None of the money went to somebody who should not have had it. And now there's been new safeguards put in place to make sure that that continues to be the case.
Did we find anywhere, any place, at any time, any evidence that dead people got money?
No, there's no evidence of that at all.
Do you have any idea where that came from?
That talking point, you mean? I mean, that did not happen. The money has been returned. There are safeguards in place, and we continue to implement a program that has had an incredibly impactful outcomes for working people and their families.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. And some people don't like competent women, but I certainly appreciate your work.
The representative from Illinois, Ms. Miller, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Acting Secretary Sue, the Department of Health and Human Services and Homeland Security have acknowledged the spike in child trafficking under the Biden administration. Even the left-wing New York Times has been forced to report on the child trafficking crisis at our southern border, which has been caused by Joe Biden. On this chart here, you can see the massive spike in child trafficking during the Biden administration because Joe Biden is allowing cartels to traffic children across our border. Acting Secretary Sue, do you believe that the open border policies of the Biden administration have caused an increase in the child labor violations?
So, Congresswoman, as somebody who has worked directly with survivors of trafficking, I think that human trafficking is it's devastating, it's terrible,
okay,
it's
that's
harmful.
Not my question at all. Do you believe the open border policies have caused this spike in child trafficking and exploitation? Yes or no?
No.
No. Okay. Well, look at the statistics here. How do you explain this? Better put your glasses on there. See? The spike is during your administration. You own this because your policies have created this crisis at our border. I want to know, do you or Joe Biden take any responsibility for the spike in child exploitation?
So, Congresswoman, to be clear, trafficking is one thing and child labor is something else. Sometimes the two it could be because of trafficking that children are working in illegal conditions.
DHS is reporting that 85,000 children who cross the border are missing. Does the Department of Labor have any idea where these 85,000 actually plus? When I was at the Border Patrol suggested it's over 100,000 children. Americans are just outraged over this. Do you have any idea where these children are?
I mean, Congresswoman, when I talk about child labor and the increase in child labor, one of the reasons why we are able to document an increase is because the Department of Labor is doing our enforcement duty. The cases that have come to light because we are investigating, we are working on the ground to identify where you have children as young as 13.
You are not dealing with it. You have lost 85,000 children. Okay, so you don't know where these children are. Are you horrified that you don't know where these 85,000 children are?
I am horrified by the child labor that we have uncovered in too many workplaces.
You have lost it. Joe Biden and his administration have caused this. So moving on, Acting Secretary Sue, the job estimates from the Bureau of Labor Statistics are consistently false. Financial media outlets have reported the numbers are repeatedly false. As you can see here, the reports, either you're putting out fake numbers to get Joe Biden good headlines and then quietly revising the job numbers down, or the Bureau of Labor Statistics is failing to report accurately the numbers. Why should we continue to fund the Bureau of Labor Statistics when it's clearly not fulfilling its duties?
Congresswoman, the Bureau of Labor Statistics puts out the most reliable data about our workforce, about unemployment, about job growth in industries that there is.
Okay,
now,
never to this level have the numbers been so inaccurate. So who is responsible for this, and has anybody been held accountable for the
Congresswoman,
mistakes?
those headlines do not show that they're inaccurate. Those headlines demonstrate that part of the core of what BLS has always done is
You're
report.
wrong.
They're
You're
not wrong.
constantly doing revisions. And
The BLS has always done revisions, ma'am. The BLS does revisions as a matter of course.
Never
and the reason,
to this level has it been so inaccurately reported. We have seen here today why you cannot continue to serve as acting secretary. You are allowing cartels to traffic children into child labor sweatshops and then losing track of them. You are wildly misreporting the jobs numbers and revising them down, which suggests either political motives or incompetence. You are violating the Constitution by remaining in office when the Senate has stated they would not confirm you. You should step down. Thank you, and I yield back.
The representative from Connecticut, Ms. Hayes, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Welcome, Acting Secretary Sue. I would just like to state for the record that we have asked for multiple hearings on child labor on this committee. The Democrats have asked, and the majority has refused to do that. So I would welcome the conversation to have a real, honest discussion about what child labor looks like in this country and ways that we can address that as a problem. Thank you for being here. I jotted down a few things before I get to my questions. I just want to ask you very directly. Have you ever been an employee?
have I ever been an employee? Yes, I have.
Yes. Does the Department of Labor have any responsibility to workers, employees, if you will?
Yes, we do.
So the idea that only business owners should have any input in this space is completely flawed, because a majority of your job and the work that you do affects employees. Am I correct?
Yes, our fundamental mission is to serve the working people of this country.
That's what I thought. So it's actually quite appropriate that someone who has been an employee would lead the Department of Labor. Yes? Yes. Yes.
Thank you, Congresswoman.
I also want to bring up another interesting thing that I heard. In my district, I've seen a lot of businesses who hire individuals with disabilities, cafes that are thriving, new businesses that have opened. It's actually a very just exciting trend in the district where the community is involved and invested. We've also seen a lot of second career older Americans who are getting trained for a new career as a result of workforce development. Can you tell me why the Department of Labor even cares about programs like diversity, equity, and inclusion?
Thank you, Congresswoman. So as I've said, we have seen record labor force participation of prime-age working people in this country. We're also seeing record levels across various communities, including people with disabilities. And that's really important to us. We have an Office of Disability Employment Policy at the Department of Labor because it's so important to make sure that when we create opportunity, everybody gets to participate. Part of what we are seeing when it comes to individuals with disabilities is because of really changes over the last couple decades, more and more individuals with disabilities are doing work through something called competitive integrated employment, which also allows them to participate more fully in the workplace. This is good
diversity,
for them.
equity, and inclusion includes bringing all people into the workplace and making sure that they have a full workplace experience.
Yes,
That's
yes.
what I thought. Thank you for sharing that, because I think people are confused about what that means and how we all benefit when we put more people back to work. Another thing that I heard come up in this hearing over and over is just the idea of people working in person. And I think that if our programs are geared to training the next generation workforce, we have to be creative and innovative and get people out in the communities. And to your point that you said over and over, showing up to work does not mean sitting at a desk all day. Sometimes it's face-to-face in the community talking to people. In the time that I have left, I will get to my actual questions. I'm really, really interested in the Career Training Fund that the Department of Labor has included as part of their proposed budget, $8 billion for this program. I have two questions. One kind of dovetails on what I just asked. How would this program incorporate the existing workforce, but also keep pace and prepare for a changing workforce? And what supports would be provided for participants, things like food, transportation, things like that, that people need to remove the barriers so that they can get this training?
Thank you so much, Congresswoman. So I often say that I think of the workforce system as a form of infrastructure too. It's not physical roads and bridges, but it's the roads and bridges that connect people to the jobs they need and employers to the people that they need. And that infrastructure has to be as strong as our physical infrastructure. So the programs we've been talking about today are part of that. Registered apprenticeships, for example, sector-based training, the role of educational institutions. So the $8 billion grant is meant to help to supplement to make sure that every individual who is looking for a job and who needs to be in a training program to do so has some support to do that. It's one piece of the overall puzzle for how we meet this demand that employers have. And again, in a growing economy, we're seeing more and more employers looking for workers. That everybody has the support that they need to do that. And we look forward to working with you and other members of the committee and of Congress to
Thank you. I'm over my time, but I do appreciate you being here. And the last thing I'll just say is that we worked really hard on the legislation to get people back to work, to make things here, and to get language like fair labor standards into that legislation to make sure it affects our communities. I would really appreciate a commitment from the department to make sure that that is followed all the way through so that my constituents feel the benefit of that work.
You have my
With that, I
commitment,
yield back.
Congresswoman.
The representative from Texas, Mr. Moran, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Acting Secretary Sue, my name is Nathaniel Moran. I've got a few questions today about the Regulatory Flexibility Act and the new independent contractor rule. First, let's start with the Regulatory Flexibility Act. Can you tell me if you know what that is?
I believe that you are talking about a rule, a law that we adhere to in our rulemaking to make sure that we are hearing from all stakeholders, including small businesses, in the process of our rulemaking?
I'll give you a B because you exactly right. You have to do it. You have to listen to the small business owners, but then you have to quantify in your rulemaking process exactly what the effect would be, the administrative burden, the cost burden on small businesses if a rule was to go into place. From 1980, it's been around for a long time. Most agencies actually don't do it. About 75% of the time, they actually don't go through the process they're supposed to go through. In this particular case, I'm glad you even know what it is because I want to ask you about how the Department of Labor goes through this process and how it went through that process on the independent contractor rule. Do you know?
Thank you, Congressman. I hope my parents aren't watching because they'll not like that B, but thank you. I know the rule because we take our obligations in the rulemaking space very, very seriously. People often complain that we take too long to put out rules.
All right, well, then I'm going to give you another grade. The grade for the department on this one is an F because the estimate on the rulemaking for the independent contractor rule said that the estimated compliance cost of the administrative burdens and the expenses to small businesses if the independent contractor rule were to go into place was, in your opinion, in the Department of Labor's opinion, a mere 30 minutes and less than $25 for a small business. Now, you and I know better than that because the proposed original rule was 200 pages. We know that it's going to take longer than 30 minutes just to at least read the proposal as we're going down that process. But for businesses, if they've got people going from independent contractors to now employees, we've got a ton more expenses that are going to be on the line, including new health care expenses, tax expenses, workers' compensation expenses, retirement, paid leave, all of that stuff that you tout as a benefit to businesses is actually a burden on businesses. Did you guys take that into account when you determined that it was going to be merely 30 minutes and less than $25 impact if the independent contractor rule went into place?
So, Congressman, as I said, we take all of our obligations seriously. When it comes to rulemaking at the Department of Labor, when we do OSHA rules, in fact, we have another requirement to engage with small businesses. And then in all of our rules, we comply with the act that you named.
So who is it in the Department of Labor that should get the F? Is it you or the person, a person under you? And I'd be glad to get a name of the person that actually said it's a mere 30 minutes and $25 for this independent contractor rule.
Well, Congressman, being that it's National Small Business Week, I also want to say one of the things that we make sure to do is to provide as much compliance assistance as we can so that once our rules are put in place, we are helping especially small businesses who we know bear different burdens, who we know don't have the HR shops or the legal shops that might help them to do all of that
Between
work.
the two of us, I'm the only one of us that was a small business owner. I can tell you the federal government is not there to help you. It is there to put a burden and a regulatory barrier in front of you most of the times to exceed and to succeed in this life.
I mean,
I'm going to stop
respectfully,
there.
though, sir, the small businesses who really need a level playing field on which to compete so that when they play by the rules, others do too.
Yeah, and I can tell you most small businesses are people that want to try to get into small business, minority-owned businesses and women-owned businesses in particular need the independent contractor rule to be what it was, not it is. I'm going to yield the remainder of my time to Mr. Kiley, and then he's going to pick up where I left off. Mr. Kiley?
Good morning, Acting Secretary Sue. I only have a few seconds here, so maybe just to lay some groundwork. Can you just let me know how things are going with the implementation of the independent contractor rule? I think it's been, 7 weeks or so. What has changed? What have there been enforcement actions? What's going on there?
So we have some tools in place. They're basically small entity guides to, following up on Congressman Moran's question, to help small businesses, but employers, to understand the rule and to be able to comply
those are
with it.
educational.
That's one.
But in terms of the department, doing enforcement actions or otherwise, acting to enforce the new rule, what have you done that's different than under the old rule?
I mean, misclassification has been a concern of the department, making sure that employees who should receive all of the labor law protections to which they're entitled actually get them. I don't know if we're talking past each other deliberately or unintentionally. So let me just say, I think there's a difference between somebody who sets up shop to do something that they have a talent, they have an ability. It could be somebody, somebody sets up they're an independent contractor to do plumbing, and we hire them to come do plumbing in our building. There's something different between that and someone who's an employee working in a situation, sometimes side by side with other people who are actually called employees, but they're called independent contractors and therefore denied their basic rights under the law.
Okay, we'll continue this conversation in a little bit. At this point, I'll recognize the representative from Pennsylvania, Ms. Wild.
Thank you very much. Secretary Sue, let me just say thank you for coming back to endure yet another hearing before this committee. I apologize for the occasional lack of civility. In my many years of courtroom experience before I came to Congress, this kind of lack of civility, cutting witnesses off, not letting them finish an answer, not really caring what the truth of the matter was, or drawing upon their experience to provide a full picture, would never have been tolerated by a judge. I know we're not in a courtroom. Sometimes I often wish that we were, so that we had somebody independent who could call out that kind of thing. I have never owned a business, but I, as a lawyer, for 35 and some years, represented many businesses, both small and large. And during those years, I often had occasion to counsel one of my clients on whether they could classify an employee or certain employees as independent contractors. Often, the business was very anxious to classify them as independent contractors for reasons that I think we all are aware, but just to summarize, because the wage laws, safe workplace protections, retirement benefits, and other benefits would not go to such employees or such independent contractors. I many times had to go through with these employers the 6-factor rule that has, for a very, very long time, been the rule in this country until the Trump administration decided to get rid of it, and explain to the employer why these people that worked for them could or could not be classified as independent contractors. And it was a very detailed process. And I will say, sometimes I didn't give my clients, the business owners, the answer they wanted, but it was the truthful legal answer. And so I think it's really important that people understand more about the independent contractor rule and the misinformation that has come from my opponents on the other side of the aisle about this rule. Can you explain what it does and does not do? The Biden rule I'm talking about that was put back into place to reinstate that 6-point
Thank
test.
you, Congresswoman.
Sure.
So the test for whether someone is an employer or independent contractor has been developed over many decades, mainly by courts. And our rule takes the criteria that courts have put into place and makes them the rule under the Fair Labor Standards Act. That's what the rule is if you just look at the case law. As you mentioned, the last administration's rule was out of step with that case law, and so we have now restored it. I didn't make up the factors. My team did not make up the factors. We put in place a rule that was the standing rule for a very long time, and it is multifactored.
Just let me interrupt briefly. So it wasn't, in fact, a rule that was fashioned on the California Assembly Bill AB 5, but rather was a reinstatement of what has existed for decades?
Correct. And in fact, we were explicit in doing it that we did not have the authority to adopt what was AB 5, but the ABC test, which exists in a number of states.
Okay. And so what kinds of cases have you seen that are problematic in your position in terms of violations of the independent contractor rule? Tell us how it hurts workers.
So I mentioned, for example, we've had a case recently that involved residential home care workers. These are caregivers. The Congresswoman Jayapal talked about just how so many workers in that industry end up working long hours, low wages, without basic protections. We see this in restaurants where someone is washing dishes and is called an independent contractor. We have seen it in hotels where a hotel operator will hire some housekeepers, cleaners, to do the work as employees, and others doing the same work call them independent contractors.
And those are great examples. By the way, often that enables the employer to avoid certain kinds of payroll taxes. Am I correct?
That is correct.
And in turn, the worker is not getting the benefit of those payroll taxes, such as paying into Social Security and benefits and that kind of thing, correct?
Correct.
And is it correct, by the way, there sometimes seems to be a difference of opinion on this in this committee, but the Department of Labor is not there just to protect the rights of employers. Am I right about that?
Correct.
But workers.
Yes, and in doing so, we also help create a level playing field and support a strong economy that also benefits employers.
Thank you very much. I yield back.
The representative from California, Ms. Steele, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. I want to submit the record this article from the San Bernardino Sun, published on April 6th, titled "Julie Su Prepares to Forgive Herself for Julie Su's Mistakes." The article references guidance issued by the Department of Labor in December 2023 and potential for forgiveness of an estimated $30 billion in fraudulent pandemic unemployment benefit payments issued by California Economic Development Department. After looking at guidance from December regarding state finality laws, it appears that the DOL is in effect allowing states to sweep fraud under the rug and not pursue fraudsters and recoup the billions lost to them. this is what article is saying. So, Acting Secretary Sue, thank you very much for coming out today, because I've been really asking this to you directly, because this is very important hearing. And I want to request, before I ask a question, that provide this committee with a copy of February 2024 letter referenced in this article and any relevant correspondence between California EDD and DOL.
Those exhibits are submitted without objection.
Thank you. Does DOL intend to forgive the nearly $30 billion in fraudulent payments that the California EDD paid out to fraudsters, scammers, and known international organized crime rings that occurred under you in California?
Thank you, Congresswoman, for giving me a chance to address that. It is absolutely false that the guidance that the Department of Labor put out would forgive any fraud. So fraud is never okay. We do not condone it. We should not overlook it. And in fact, both our OIG and others have been trying to combat the fraud that was overwhelmingly paid in a program that was set up by Congress to address the pandemic, that allowed for both automatic backdating and self-certification in its design. So the fraud is not acceptable, and we, at the Department of Labor, certainly did not waive any kind of efforts to combat the fraud or to recover fraudulent payments. In fact, just recently, my Inspector General chased some funds all the way to another country in which fraudulent funds were used to purchase property, and we are now trying to seize that property in order to get the money back. We're serious about combating fraud. What the guidance did was, within the CARES Act, there is the ability to waive non-fraudulent overpayments that might have been made to individuals, working people who struggled through the pandemic like anybody else and got overpayments that were not their own fault. And so the waiver is meant to—
let me just ask you then, out of $30 billion from California, that how much is just overpayment, not fraud by those criminals? So how much are we talking about?
It's a good question. I don't know the answer to that, ma'am, because after I left California, there was still work being done, and I think all states are still trying to assess exactly what happened during that period of time, but again, overwhelmingly in a program that was not typical unemployment insurance. It was
I just reclaim my time, but thank you very much for your assuring us that you are not doing it because forgiving these fraudulent payments would appear to be a major conflict of interest.
Congresswoman, can I also clarify that the guidance was not just for California? The guidance about non-fraud overpayments.
I get that, because out of $130 million, 25% actually fraudulent payments was made in California. So that's why I'm asking you for that. And not only that, State Controller knows California is waiting for final federal approval of EDD's request on indicated in the February 2024 letter before the event can be recognized in the financial statement as a forgiveness of debt. That's what actually they wrote it on the financial report on the California financial report. So I really want to see that why they created this kind of language on their financial statement, because you already knew, because you are the one stated that EDD's lack of preparation left it unable to manage. So you knew that when we were getting CARES Act money that, you know what, all these criminals, they might going to take money. And then you already stated that California did not have enough security measures in the place when you were actually labor secretary in California. So you know what, this is actually under your watch that happened. If you are actually forgiving this fraudulent payments to California, it's not really acceptable. And I really thank you for your assuring us that you are not going to do it. But you did it on AB 5. Actually, AB 5 is wiping out all the independent contractors, except the few industries that you said that you would not and could not to implement in the nationwide in United States, but you did it anyway on March 11th, that your department issued new rules.
The gentlewoman's time has expired.
So, you know what, I really want to make sure that you are not forgiving this $30 billion out of California, that money went to all these criminal rings. So thank you. My time is up, and
the representative from Indiana, Mr. Mervan, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Acting Secretary Sue. Thank you for being here today to discuss the President's budget request for the upcoming fiscal year. After months of deliberation, Congress recently came to a consensus and passed the fiscal year 2024 budget, which I was proud to support on behalf of the workers and families of Northwest Indiana. Today, the committee has come together to discuss continued investment in these programs for the upcoming fiscal year. I would like to highlight the rule recently finalized by the Department to ensure fiduciary investment advice is provided in good faith across industries, including stakeholders representing retirees, public safety, educators, government employees, transit and airlines, the trades, and more. The retirement fiduciary rule has been widely supported. Recently, an estimation by the Council of Economic Advisors determined that conflicted advice could cost savers up to $5 billion a year. That is why I was proud to co-lead a letter with Congresswoman Capter in support of the retirement security rule. For people in my district and across the nation, deciding how to invest their retirement nest egg is the biggest financial decision they will have to make. For families planning their budgets around rising costs of living, passing up vacations, and going out to dinner so they can responsibly put money away for retirement, a devalued investment in their retirement is just not feasible. Can you explain how congressional action through the Congressional Review Act, for example, would negatively impact workers and their families?
Thank you, Congressman. So, as you already said, the retirement security rule is meant to protect the retirement savings of hardworking Americans, to make sure that when you put away money throughout the time, throughout all your working years, that when you seek to invest that money, that the advice that you get is based on your best interests as the investor rather than on any financial benefit or the conflict of interest that might come to the advisor. Most people think that that's what they're getting anyway, but as you noted, there are studies that demonstrate that conflicted advice can be very costly to working people. And in fact, the study that you mentioned by the Council of Economic Advisors was just about one retirement product. It was only about fixed index annuities. And so this is just an area in which we want to make sure that working people, when their retirement savings are being invested and they go to someone for advice about that they can actually rely on that advice, maximizing their savings and giving them some real peace of mind in retirement.
Additionally, how does the President's budget request for the Employee Benefit Security Administration ensure the department has the resources to protect retirement benefits, particularly those of small savers, from poor conflicted investment advice?
Well, thank you so much the rule is important because it sets a standard. The budget request for our Employee Benefit Security Administration is so that we can enforce the law. And I'll just give two quick examples of what our EBSA does. In one example, we had a situation where a retiree had worked for 30 years, and at the end of his work life, he didn't get any of his retirement benefits. He became part of what is known as like a lost participant in a program. When we got involved, we were able to identify that he was entitled to that money, and he and his family got a significant lump sum payment and then payments going forward. So one of them is just making sure that people who save for retirement aren't lost in the system and actually get their benefits. And once we did that for one individual, it ended up being something that the employer and the plan sponsor did for others too. The second example I want to share is because EBSA also helps to make sure that people get the health benefits to which they're entitled. And we had a case recently where an individual needed a heart transplant, and his insurer, his employer-sponsored insurer, said it was not a necessary surgery. We got involved. We found that it was covered, and that man is alive today because of it. I haven't even talked about our work in the mental health space, but it's so important to enforce laws in order to make sure that they actually feel meaningful and real for working people in this country.
I want to thank you for standing up for working men and women and for setting guidelines to make it a fair and level playing field. I thank you very much for your work. With that, I yield back.
I'd like to play a quick video.
I'm sorry, did you ask me a question?
I recognize myself. We're going to play a quick video. Do you support reclassifying independent contractors as employees against their will?
For those workers that work in the gig economy, absolutely.
That was with the chosen witness of the minority at a recent hearing, so Dr. Katie Wells of Georgetown. Do you agree with her? Do you support classifying independent contractors as employees against their will?
I'm so sorry, Congressman. I didn't realize. Can you just do that again?
Sure. Let's play it again. Do you support reclassifying independent contractors as employees against their will?
For those workers that work in the gig economy, absolutely.
Agree? Disagree?
Well, Congressman, let me say, I do not agree that the acting Secretary of Labor has the authority to force any kind of classification against people's will. I will say that the laws of this country protect working people when they should be called employees and are misclassified as independent contractors.
So when you say, okay, when you say that you don't have the authority to do that against people's will, what do you mean? There's a new rule that you're going to go around enforcing that's going to change people's status, right?
I mean, I'm sorry, I watched that very quickly. It sounded like your question was, do you support forcibly making people who are independent contractors in the gig economy into employees?
Sure, and yes or no, do you support that?
Well, what I'm saying is nothing that we are doing at the Department of Labor, including putting out a rule that restores the employee versus independent contractor rule to decades of case law, again, not criteria that I made up, not a test that I thought should be put in place that I wrote. It's based on decades of case law interpreting the Fair Labor Standards Act.
And so nothing would do that, nothing about that would force someone into employee status against their will, correct? That's what you're saying.
I don't. That's a different question from the first question that you asked, though. So
not really. So if someone says, "I want to be an independent contractor," that's good enough for you. You're not going to try to challenge that.
Well, the law says, again, this is not just about what I think. The law says that what you call someone, even if, let's say, they've signed an agreement saying, like, let's say that's what you would use, right? They signed an agreement saying they're an independent contractor.
Right.
They signed an agreement saying they would get 1099s, that should be enough. The case law is clear that that is not sufficient to find that someone is an independent contractor.
Okay, but you've just created a new rule that you are heavily involved in creating that received a lot of notice and comment, and you finalized it, you signed off on it. And so the question is whether under that rule someone will be forcibly reclassified against their will. So let's take a concrete example. There's a group called Women in Motion. This is a group of truck drivers. Don't know if you've met with them. I'd really encourage you to. They're a great group, and they've told some stories. For example, we have Bambi. Is that Bambi behind me? Yes, it is. Who says that she likes to be an independent contractor. She's chosen to do so because I wanted to run my own business. I felt it was time for me to grow. And when asked how a ban on independent contracting would impact her life, she said it would be devastating. My family depends on my income and the flexibility that being an independent contractor provides. A ban or restriction would limit both of those. So can you assure Bambi, who is an owner-operator, a truck driver, that this new rule will not change her status?
Well, Congressman, the outcome of applying the test really does depend on the facts of a particular circumstance.
Okay, but she's an independent owner-operator, a truck driver. There's a lot of do you know how many of those people there are, by the way, in the country? Independent contractors who are truck drivers?
Well, I understand that. I understand what you're saying.
How many are there? Do you know?
I don't know the answer to that.
Okay, there's about 350,000, I believe. So just take your standard, typical example. Bambi, can you assure her that you're not going to come after her and tell her that she's got to run her business differently now? Can you assure her of that?
So, Congressman, the purpose of having a rule and a test is so that we can make sure that working people who should be entitled to the protections of the Fair Labor Standards Act get them. That is not inconsistent with the ability of bona fide independent contractors to operate.
Okay, I'm asking you a simple question about this particular person. And you can answer these questions because when you were labor secretary, you didn't enforce AB 5 against whole categories of people that were exempted and were defined in the statute as it not being subject to. So I'm asking you right now, are independent owner-operator truck drivers going to be treated differently under the rule that you just published than they were under the pre-existing rule? Yes or no?
Well, first, let me say, Congressman, what you just said yourself is that several categories were exempted from AB 5, so therefore not enforcing against them is what the law said, right? They were not covered by AB 5.
Right.
The point you're making and saying it's simple, I'm telling you it's not simple because you have to apply the facts of a case to the law.
You're missing the point. At the point at which in a statute you could say this whole category, this whole profession is exempt from the law, that was not a fact-dependent determination. And so I'm asking this particular profession, truck drivers, independent owner-operators, hundreds of thousands of them that are vital to our supply chain, can you give us an answer right now as to how they will be treated under this new rule?
Well, our new rule does not have entire exemptions for entire industries. That's not what the case law says. And so we were following both the plain language of the Fair Labor Standards Act and the cases that have interpreted it. That is what is within my authority to do, and that is what the final rule does.
Ms. McBath from Georgia is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair, and thank you so much, Secretary Sue, for taking the time to be with us here today. And I have read your remarks. I've read your testimony. And by every measure, the economy under yours and President Biden's leadership is doing quite well, despite what others would have us believe. It's doing quite well. We continue to see a strong job market with record low unemployment, but there's more than this that can be done to ensure that, of course, every American has access to the opportunities that will lead them to highly skilled and quality careers and enable them to provide a good life for themselves and for their families. And almost all of the good-paying jobs in our economy actually require some sort of post-secondary credential or education, and that could be an apprenticeship, a short-term training program, or a 2- or 4-year degree program and higher. However, most Americans in the labor force have either some college education or actually less, and like a high school diploma or maybe even equivalent. Despite most Americans not having a college degree, the federal government still only spends a fraction on workforce development programs compared to what is spent on traditional higher education programs, as you can actually see behind me. We spend 5, 10, or even 20 times more in any given year on our university system than we do actually on employment and training services. So the fact of the matter is that you do not have to have a college degree to be successful, although it certainly helps, but it's not the only path to a good-paying job. But that's not the message that we're sending to these vastly different funding levels. Shouldn't we be meeting our students where they are and provide support for these necessary training programs? It's a disservice to our students and our employers, as shown by the huge amounts of college debt and workforce shortages that we see across the country. This failure to invest in our workforce is just not leaving working families and businesses behind. It is risking our competitive advantage on the world stage globally. As you can see here, we spend drastically less on these efforts than our allies in other comparable countries around the world. The U.S. spends just 0.04% of our GDP on workforce training and employment programs. America should lead, but that is unfortunately not possible when we habitually underfund our workforce programs. Secretary Sue, can you talk about how important it is for us to fully fund these efforts and expand upon the work that you have done on apprenticeships, and other non-traditional workforce development programs.
Thank you very much, Congresswoman. We have models for what works to connect people to good jobs and employers to people. I travel the country and I've seen them. You are hopefully seeing them in your districts too. And we need to scale those models, both because employers are looking for working people and because working people are looking for good jobs. And so registered apprenticeships is one of those I've talked about our workforce system as being a kind of infrastructure too, roads and bridges that connect people and employers. If that is the case, then registered apprenticeships are like super highways. They are a very effective way of bringing people who do not have a four-year degree and don't want to get a four-year degree into the workforce, into a good-paying job with security and a lifelong opportunity to be able to contribute, to build, to make things. And so our budget request is really about making sure that we take things that we know can be done to fulfill employer needs and to make opportunity broadly available and double down on those investments. And those investments are good for everybody. I mean, they're good for people of all races, from every community, because the desire for people to be in a good job that will change their lives is something that I know you see in your district and I see everywhere I go.
Well, thank you for that, because as you and I discussed, the new nature of work is what we have now, in particular coming through COVID. And so workers now are caregivers. They are themselves looking for education. They're working. So we have to make sure that we are able to address all of the needs that they have, specifically in being able to find the educational resources they need, but more importantly, that they deserve. And thank you for your testimony.
Thank you.
The representative from Florida, Mr. Bean, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon to you, Committee. Acting Secretary Sue, welcome. We're glad to have you here. How long have you been the acting secretary?
I'm not going to necessarily get this exactly right, the date, but I believe I was nominated in March of last year.
Okay. Is that like March of last year? That would be 13 months. Would that be accurate? About that? Yeah, about 13 months. Congratulations. I think you've set a record. My team says that you're the longest serving acting secretary that we've had in quite some time. How long do you plan to stay without being confirmed? You've been nominated twice.
So, Congressman, I came to the administration as the Deputy Secretary of Labor. I was confirmed for that job in 2021. When my predecessor left, I became the acting secretary through the regular statutes that govern succession.
How long do you plan to? Is it okay for somebody to serve in the capacity Article 2, Section 2 of the Constitution? Our founding fathers said, there should be advise and consent that secretaries should be confirmed. And so my question is, how long do you plan to stay if you're not confirmed?
Well, I was very honored to be nominated by the president.
I'm with you on that. It's a big
secretary.
deal. It's a big deal where I am, where it's a big deal. But how long are you planning to stay?
Our statutes, and I believe this was already mentioned by the ranking member.
You don't know?
No. They indicate
you have an
that
idea
I'm
of how long
legally
you're going to stay.
serving in the position. In fact, the reason why we have a GAO opinion about that is because
so you would say
asked,
then,
I believe,
you would say people can stay as long, secretaries can stay as long as they want, as long as they have a ruling, they can stay without being confirmed? Is that what I'm hearing?
No. I said I was confirmed as a deputy secretary in 2021.
But no, I was asking about
Yes.
your acting secretary. You're no longer the deputy. You're the person. You're the person in charge. And our Constitution says you're to be confirmed. You're not confirmed. How long you staying?
So when my predecessor left, I became the acting secretary.
Would you
legally.
say it's okay then by saying you're not leaving? You're saying future secretaries or the next administration, we don't even have to worry about the Constitution. We can just stay as long as you want. Are you saying that, Acting Secretary Sue?
Absolutely, that is not what I'm saying. But this question about whether I'm legally serving has been asked and answered, and thank you for being the body that asked.
Yeah, I'm just saying, but you haven't really answered it. But here's the next question. I don't know. That you see the precedent. It's the Sue loophole if you stay forever without getting confirmed.
Well, it's not a loophole at all, sir.
You're staying without. I'm just asking how long you're staying. Which, by the way, happy Small Business Week. This is a week you've acknowledged it. I'm on the Small Business Committee. We're having a showcase in the Visitor Center today at 3:00. If you go talk to those business owners, I encourage you to do it. They're going to tell you that they're getting strangled with new rules, new regulations that makes it very hard. I've owned 4 small businesses. It's tough. You're often the first one to come, the last one to leave, and the last one to get paid. It's a struggle all the way. Sometimes that small business is an independent contractor. The last survey I saw, 86% of independent contractors love it, what they're doing, love the gig economy, love doing what they're doing. They don't want to change. And so I know Chair Kiley asked you this, but are you willing to continue to reclassify with over 86% of independent contractors saying, I want no change, I love my job, and that's going to threaten their livelihood? Are you still willing to go forward even though this is going to be against their will to reclassify them as an independent contractor?
Well, Congressman, in addition to the 15.3 million jobs that have been created in this country since President Biden came into office, we are seeing a small business boom at the same time. I don't know the exact number. It's over 15 million small business applications.
They don't want to lose their jobs. They don't lose their job. California did something very similar. AB 5 in California. They had to exempt over 100 professions because it was going to be a disaster. Are we prepared that this could be a disaster and people lose their jobs? Finally, let me ask you this. You believe, as do I, people should have choice in their health care, to quality health care. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I believe people should have quality health care.
I would too. I would agree that they should have quality health care. But let me tell you what you and DOL did. The previous administration published a rule to allow those gig economy workers, the independent contractors. Their rule allowed independent contractors to join the employer's health plan. CBO projected 400,000 people are now getting their health care through this rule. But yet what you did, your agency just did a rule that's finalized this week, reversing that and essentially kicking off 400,000 people that get their health care from their employer, and that rule changed that. So we've just kicked 400,000 people off. I am bummed out about that, and my time's expired. I yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you so much.
The representative from Florida, Ms. Wilson, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. And I'd like to thank Acting Secretary Sue for being here today. Welcome. Welcome to you. Jobs, jobs, jobs has always been my mantra, and our economy added 303,000 jobs in March, and the unemployment rate tricked down to 3.8%. The jobless rate has been below 4% for 26 months in a row, the longest stretch in more than 50 years. Am I correct that these numbers are right and they're night and day compared to what occurred during the Trump administration? Can you talk about the economy that the Biden administration inherited and the policies that congressional Democrats and President Biden implemented to turn things around? I think people are forgetting where we were and how far we have come.
Thank you, Congresswoman. Yes, when President Biden first came into office, just to do what you just said, to think about where we were, unemployment rate was at an all-time high. The pandemic was raging. People didn't know if they were going to be able to get toilet paper or baby formula when they needed it. And today, we have seen 15.3 million jobs created. We've seen an unemployment rate less than 4% for the longest stretch since the 1970s. Labor force participation rate is strong. Real wages, especially for low and middle income Americans, are up, meaning that it has outpaced inflation, which translates into more money into working people's pockets. And we are in the midst of delivering historic investments in our nation's infrastructure, in manufacturing, in clean energy, in bringing industries back to the United States so that working people can have good jobs and good union jobs right here in the United States. And it's important to also note that none of this was promised. In fact, most people, even as it was happening, kept saying that it was impossible, or that it was too hot, it was going to crash, or that the recession was coming. And I think it's important to just acknowledge that while we still have work to do, and we need to continue to do it, and we know that working people still need more support, and that is partly reflected in our budget, that the recovery that we have seen would not have been possible without strong leadership, good economic policies, investing in working people, and in really trying to expand opportunity to all Americans.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much. We need that. We need to know. Secretary Sue, 86% of public school districts reported challenges hiring teachers this year. As wages have increased in other sectors, teacher pay has not kept pace. The average teacher's salary, when adjusted for inflation, has actually decreased over the last decade. This has led to more educators leaving the profession, and that turnover negatively affects student learning. Next week is Teacher Appreciation Week, and so with the support of fellow lifelong educators in Congress, I introduced the American Teacher Act in the 118th conference. The intent of the act is to address teacher shortage by directing the Department of Education to award teacher salary incentive grants. My bill establishes grants to increase the minimum salary of public elementary and secondary school teachers. It also authorizes a national campaign regarding the value of the teaching profession. In fact, in the last two State of the Union addresses, President Biden declared from the podium increasing teacher pay as a national priority. And I quote, "I want to give public school teachers a raise," is what he said. And the next year he said, "Let's give public school teachers a raise." Do you have any thoughts or guidance on teacher pay raises from the Department of Labor?
Thank you very much for that, Congresswoman. As you noted, the president has been very supportive of making sure that, that teachers do well in our country. And he said many times that billionaires should not pay a lower tax rate than teachers. One of the ways that we've seen teacher pay go up over the last year is unions at the bargaining table negotiating for higher wages. We've seen that not just in among teachers, but in other industries too. We are also working to make sure that we help to fill the need for teachers through programs like the workforce ones that we are talking about. And to your point, sometimes the challenge of getting workers into a certain field is because the job quality needs to be improved, that people need to be able to know that when they do the work, they can make a decent living and feel secure and support their families and have security in retirement. And so, so we have started
time has expired.
Apprenticeship programs
the gentleman
for teachers.
from Missouri, Mr. Burleson, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Acting Secretary Sue. As it has been mentioned, you're now breaking records for the longest-serving acting secretary in the history of the United States, really. As it was mentioned, Article 2, Section 2, Clause 2 says that you're to serve, but only with the consent of the Senate. How many times has the Senate rejected your confirmation?
So, Congressman, the Senate confirmed me in 2021 to be the Deputy Secretary of Labor.
But not the Secretary. How many times have they rejected your application to be Secretary?
So the reason I'm sitting here as the Acting Labor Secretary is because of that confirmation.
And they did not confirm you. How many times?
No, once my predecessor left, I became the Acting Secretary by virtue of having been confirmed as the Deputy Secretary.
Okay, so you have not been confirmed. It's been over 13 months. At what point do you think that you're in violation of the Constitution?
Well, sir, you all asked that question of the GAO and you got your answer. I'm not in violation of any law sitting here, but I do want to say that I do respect the role of the Senate, And I think it's important.
And that's the point. Like, to me, I think that you continuing to serve is, if anything, a disrespect for the Constitution and a disrespect for the Senate. Clearly, the Senate gives deference to other secretaries under the Biden administration that they've approved. They have not given that deference to you. At what point will you acknowledge that you've not been accepted by the Senate and will step down?
I was confirmed by the Senate as the deputy in 2021.
You're not confirmed as secretary. So let's move on. Despite the fact that in my opinion, you're operating as an illegitimate secretary, your agency, even though you have zero jurisdiction over union election procedures, you've created a pro-union propaganda website called workerscenter.gov that basically regurgitates information from many of the acting, like the think tanks for labor unions and labor unions to encourage people to organize. What authority, what jurisdiction do you have to create such a website?
So, Congressman, one thing that has come up here today is the importance of listening to workers, understanding what they want, what they need, and trying to be responsive to that. One thing that we found before we created that website was some 60 million Americans would join a union if they could, if they knew how to do it, if they felt like they could do it without fear, if they could do it without retaliation.
My question was, under what jurisdiction?
So it is one of many ways that we do education and outreach. This website was responsive to what we were hearing that workers wanted. It was something that they wanted to know.
How much money did you spend on the website? This is taxpayer money that most people would objectively call propaganda. How much did you spend?
I mean, it's a worker organizing resource and knowledge center. It's meant to give anybody, really, I mean, it's public, it's on our website, knowledge about the steps to take if they want to join a union, but even just, what does a union do? What is it? It is part of...
I've got little time, so I'm going to move on to the fiduciary rule. You publicly justified the short notice for hearings that are required under ERISA and the short comment period for the new fiduciary rule by stating that the Department of Labor has already heard comments. My question is the 2004 Department of Labor fiduciary rule a new rule or not?
It is a new rule that was just finalized last week.
And if it's new rule, we're now in May 1. Okay, how long did you give for comments before you issued this new rule?
So that's a good question. Thank you, Congressman. So we had a 60-day comment period. That comment period is quite standard, not just for the Department of Labor, but also for other agencies. And during that comment period, we held 2 public hearings.
Did you get input from the National Association of Insurance Commissioners?
I have to say, sitting here, I don't know for sure, but I can certainly get that answer for you.
So they were not involved in formulating the rule, because you recognize that each state insurance commissioner serves a vital role in the process.
Well, the comment period is public, meaning we invite and frankly benefit the more widely known.
The answer is no, because their association issued a statement saying that there was virtually no coordination with state insurance regulators in implementing the rule. My time has expired. Thank you.
The representative from...
I'm sorry. Sorry. We are out of time.
The representative from Minnesota, Ms. Omar, is recognized for 5 minutes.
It's good to see you again, Secretary Sue. I wanted to talk a little bit about the child labor violations that are soaring, that have been weakening child labor laws. Could you provide update on the interagency task force on child labor and how the Department of Labor is following up on potential hotspots?
Thank you, Congresswoman. The Department of Labor has been very hard at work trying to combat the scourge of child labor. One of the reasons so much attention is being paid to it today is that we have uncovered some really horrific cases. And there's just no mistaking that these are both really young children, some of them working the night shift under very, very hazardous situations, as young as 13-year-old, working on the kill floor, using toxic chemicals, and working and losing limbs and their lives. And so last year, the last fiscal year, the Department of Labor assessed the most penalties that we have ever assessed under child labor laws. We also lead an interagency task force that you mentioned in order to make sure that all of government is working together on the various pieces that it will take to keep children safe, to engage with all the other parties that might be helpful to us as we try to identify these cases, and to hold employers accountable who engage in this practice in such blatant disregard of the law. So that task force continues to work together to identify gaps and to try to make sure that we are putting a stop to this practice.
Yeah, thank you for that. The Bureau of International Labor Affairs plays an essential role in leveling the playing field for all workers. ILAP helps enforce our trade commitments and strengthens compliance with labor standards. Could you explain how the interests and priorities of workers across the globe are interconnected? And how should we be thinking about the plight of workers in Mexico, for example, as it relates to the plight of workers here in the United States? And what would it mean if Republicans were successful in slashing the budget for ILAP?
Thank you very much.
If you can be as precise as possible. I've got one more question.
So the well-being of workers in this country is tied to the well-being of workers in other countries. When we have the ability for to create a race to the bottom in which all workers are vulnerable to exploitation and abuse, it's not good for any worker. Through our iLab, we both produce reports and advocate to make sure that, for example, prohibitions against goods made through forced labor from coming into this country are enforced. We work closely with our partners at the Department of Homeland Security on that. In terms of Mexico, there's the USMCA, the U.S.-Mexico-Canada Agreement, and we are, through iLab, play a role in making sure that those provisions are enforced and that working people in Mexico also have a full and fair right to join a union of their choice, and we believe that that will improve not just working conditions for workers in Mexico, but also the competitive disadvantage that working people in the U.S. have to face when we don't ensure that workers across the globe are protected.
Yeah, thank you. I commend you for that work. I'm also proud of the work that the Biden administration and congressional Democrats did in enacting in the American Rescue Plan to save many multi-employer pensions. Actually, in my district, the Twin Cities Bakery Drivers Pension Plan was one that benefited from it. 1,075 pensions were saved. What would happen to my constituents, to businesses, and to employees across the nation if we did not address the multi-employer pension plan?
I mean, this is so important. This is about basic security in retirement. This is about working people who have saved and are relying on having their retirement savings so that they can stop working at the end of a career and know that they can continue to live with security. The multi-employer pension fund saving that this Congress passed and the President signed into law helps to make sure that those individuals in those funds actually get the retirement savings that they're entitled to. And as you've seen in your district, as I've heard going across the country, that has made a world of difference to a lot of working people. And at the same time, those employers who were part of that multi-employer pension fund also benefited because it allowed them to continue to operate. It's prevented them from going into bankruptcy. And so it was really a win-win. And I appreciate the work that was done to make that happen. Yeah. Proud to be part of implementing that.
Thank you. I yield back.
The representative from Pennsylvania, Mr. Smucker, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Acting Secretary Sue, for being here today. In August of last year, the Biden administration rolled out a final rule updating the Davis-Bacon Act regulations, which, of course, as you know, requires contractors that perform work on federal or federally funded construction projects to pay a government-determined prevailing wage to on-site construction workers. I myself, I worked in the construction industry for 25 years. Very proud to have been part of an industry that creates great family-sustaining, well-paid jobs. There's a lot of opportunities there. I do know, though, that artificially setting the wages will have an impact on the cost of federal projects, and I wondered if you're aware of that.
Well, one thing I want to say about that, Congressman, is that when workers are protected, when they're paid decent wages, part of the principle, I know you know this.
So do you think without federal government setting wages, they will not be paid decent wages?
Well, the goal of the Davis-Bacon and related acts is to ensure that federally funded construction projects don't depress local wages in the area where that work is being done. But the other point I wanted to make is that I understand there are many studies that demonstrate this, that when working people are paid prevailing wages and treated well, that it actually ends up having cost savings on a project because
that's
continuity.
That's not borne out by the studies. In fact, there's a nonpartisan Beacon Hill Institute estimates that Davis-Bacon methodology increases federal project costs by 7%. And I've seen that firsthand with Pennsylvania prevailing wages. I've seen the additional cost. Do you think that's fair to taxpayers at a time when construction costs are increasing dramatically due to inflation? Do you think it's fair at this time to add an additional cost to taxpayers?
Well, again, I think the reason why the laws are in place is to make sure that federally funded construction projects don't depress wages in the area, and that's policy. But I also think it's fair to make sure that doesn't happen.
So, do you think the federal government should set wages in other areas as well?
Well, my role as the acting labor secretary is to enforce provisions that Congress passes. So we have a federal minimum wage. We have prevailing wages.
This update did not come from Congress. In fact, we oppose it. We sent a letter. I sent a letter with Chairwoman Fox opposing this change specifically because it will increase federal costs. So this is not Congress that has done this. This has come directly from the Biden administration.
Well, so the rule was a Department of Labor rule, but the basic principle that federally funded construction projects should be set at a prevailing wage so that it does not have a negative effect on the wages in that area is part of the Davis-Bacon and related acts of Congress.
So why should the government set construction wages but not nurses' wages, for instance?
Right. So I think that is a question for Congress. I mean, if you set nurses' wages at something, I would be enforcing those wages as well. I think.
Do you think the federal government should set wages in other sectors other than construction?
I think a basic wage floor beneath which nobody should be forced to live and work is incredibly important.
But that's not what Davis-Bacon is. This is not a minimum wage. This is literally having the federal government abandon free market principles and set wages at some level. That's what this is. This is a minimum wage. I do want a very quick question on apprenticeships as well. I know others have been talking about this. You've said you want to cooperate with states. I just want to put in the record that many states, not in a bipartisan manner, have talked about these new regulations. For instance, Michigan, this is a quote, said the new regulations and requirements will be an added formidable burden to employees. Connecticut said the rule would, quote, have a chilling effect on employers entering apprenticeships. Your home state of California said the rule does not clearly demonstrate the evidence and value of adding another component to a current CTE structure that can accomplish many of the same intents without new constricting federal rules. So I just want to express my concern, but also the concerns of many states where we will see less individuals involved in apprenticeship programs. I think you and I do agree that apprenticeships are a very great career path to a great job and to a great career. But these regulations will not help to allow more people to enter. It will have the opposite effect. And I'm out of time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The representative from New Mexico, Ms. Ligra Fernandez, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. And thank you so much, Acting Secretary Sue. I want to begin with an apology for the disrespectful behavior by some of my colleagues. Rather than allowing you the opportunity to provide substantive answers to their questions, you've been interrupted numerous times. I also want to clarify, the Senate has never rejected your nomination. In fact, your nomination as Deputy Secretary was passed, and your nomination as Secretary was passed out of the appropriate committee. The fact that you have stood with workers and workers' families should be something that we all celebrate, because that is indeed in your job description. And we appreciate it. I know that the workers and the workers' families in my district and in my state appreciate it. I want to also thank you for doing a great summary in response to some of the earlier questions about how far our economy has grown, how many jobs we've added in the last 4 years, especially when you answer the question, are we better off today than we were 4 years ago? 4 years ago was dark under former President Trump, right? People were unemployed. They were worried about losing their apartments. As you pointed out, you couldn't buy toilet paper, right? It was scary. It was dark. And because of the investments that were done, we have come out of that. But there is a lot more work to do, especially in rural areas that I represent. We know that education skills, apprenticeships, those make a big difference in securing better paying jobs. And you need the better paying job if you're going to fight the inflation that has been, let's be honest about it, fueled by greedy corporations who record profits are basically on the backs of consumers. Let's be honest about where inflation comes through. And there's some great Federal Reserve articles about that. But these certification courses that are really important, I think, for apprentices and other ones, they don't always apply in rural areas. In my district, an aspiring welder or commercial driver would have to drive 3 hours round trip to get to some of these federally funded training programs. So I want to see if you can talk about expanding the Department of Labor Force's Workforce Opportunity for Rural Communities initiative so that we can start granting those funds in Western rural communities. On a bipartisan basis, right? Well, the rest is checkerboard, blue, red. We need to get that funding out there. How do you see that? How that would make a difference if we moved it to the West in rural communities?
Thank you, Congresswoman. And yes, the workforce opportunities in rural communities is something that that we wanted to do in order to make sure that we are really achieving equity, that every community is seeing benefits from the investments that are being made. And we are now, I think, on the 5th round of those investments. And being able to expand them will only allow us to further reach individuals, families, communities who have been left out for far too long. It's an important time to do it as well, because part of President Biden's vision is that we invest in every single community. So, for example, when we build, make sure that there's reliable, high-speed broadband in every community, the ability of people who live in that community to actually work on those jobs is really, really significant. And so our workforce opportunities in rural communities grant helps to make sure that that can happen. Congresswoman, if I could also just mention, because you were here and the Congresswoman Wilson just left, but you both have youth build grants as well that we just announced in your districts. And that's another way that we supplement the workforce programs to make sure that we're reaching all communities, and that one's obviously, as you know.
I have an appropriations letter where hopefully we'll start seeing some of these programs in my district. I want to quickly turn to something else that both New Mexico and other places like Arkansas and Missouri, the arts and recreation, the creative sector really makes a difference, about $1 trillion to the economy. I want to have the Department of Labor work with us to explore how federal workforce development programs, such as apprenticeships, can better serve non-traditional sectors like the arts, like outdoor recreation. We just passed the Explore Act on the floor of the House, led by Chairman Westerman, my Republican colleague from Arkansas. He talked about what they're doing in terms of that kind of economic growth in these rural areas. Would love to work with you on that and look forward to talking about that more in future, because I have run out of time and I am going to yield back. Thank you so much,
I would love to work
Acting
with you on that.
Secretary Sue.
The representative from Kansas, Mr. Estes, is recognized.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you, Acting Secretary Sue, for being here. I know you've been here for a long time, so I'll try to go through quickly with my comments. I know last week the Department of Labor issued the so-called retirement security rule, better known as the fiduciary rule. I have some major concerns about the substance and the impact of the rule, but I'll get to it in a minute. But the administration's rollout of the rule was also disappointing. I know several of my colleagues before have talked about how it was rolled out. There were only 45 business days. It was over a holiday period. So it really was not the appropriate approach of how do you get comments back for the comment period. But instead of talking about that, I want to talk about the White House in the rollout of that used the term eliminating junk fees as part of the reason for doing this. And that's the first time ever that annuities have ever been accused of having junk fees. And so clearly, my concern is there's just the propaganda aspect of that. Can you explain how that term applies to the proposed and the final rule? And if not for this rationale that the White House trying to hype some phrase, can you explain why there's no single reference to junk fees in any of the preambles for the proposed or the final rules?
Yeah, thank you, Congressman. So our public comment period was 60 days. We held 2 public hearings as well. We received 400 individual comments, over 400, and just under 20,000 petition submissions. And I will say again that public comment period is incredibly valuable. It's very important. We take into account the comments that we get, and we try to put out a rule that is achieves the goals of whatever that rule is.
So the junk fees is what I'm really wanting to focus on, and not the number of comments.
That's a fair question. So our rule seeks to make sure that any retiree, an investor, that the advice they get from a financial advisor is in their best interest, not informed by conflicts of interest of the financial advisor. And one way that conflict of interest could come into play is that there could be a fee that the retiree has to pay.
Yes, but there's a difference, and I understand, and we would expect people to get paid a fee for providing a service. And I guess it's an insulting terminology that's used for folks that are actually trying to help people save for their retirement. And I take offense at the term junk fees being used in that manner. And I shift gears a little bit on this just from a standpoint of the cost as we're talking about fees. Just prior to the release of the fiduciary rule, the inflation numbers came out hotter again for the 3rd month in a row. Since President Biden's been in office, the cost of inflation on a monthly basis has gone up over 19%. And the Joint Economic Committee has determined that in my home state of Kansas, people are paying $1,000 more a month for the same food, the same rent, as they did in January of 2021. And wages are down 3.9% in terms of net wages since the president's come into office. So at a time when people are struggling to meet their daily needs with inflation, I'm concerned a little bit about the higher costs that are being applied to people that are trying to save. There was a Deloitte study done after the earlier fiduciary rule was brought out that more than 10 million low and middle income individuals lost access to investment assistance during the short time that 2016 fiduciary rule is effective. I mean, I personally saw middle class savers who were having to pay more in fees because of that fiduciary rule. And fortunately, the Fifth Circuit rescued American people from that. And with this new rule, it seems like the administration's wanting millions of more people of lower and middle income to be able to lose access to investment assistance and have to spend more money to keep that access. So how many individuals does the department expect to lose access to investment because of the new fiduciary rule?
Well, Congressman, also to be clear, I wasn't referring to any fee that an advisor charges as being a junk fee. I'm referring to fees that are charged to an investor that would not be charged but for that conflict of interest, right? A fee that they're paying for an investment vehicle that is not in their best interest. But we certainly, our goal is to expand retirement security, not to shrink it. And
but I guess my concern on this question was people losing access because of cost and because of the extra burden placed on the investment advisors.
Well, our hope is that by eliminating conflicts of interest, that retirement savers actually do better. Their investments are actually being put into vehicles that maximize their savings. And as was noted earlier, there are studies that show that just.
I'm glad that's a shared hope, and I'm sorry to cut you off. I am out of time, and it just that prior studies, particularly the Deloitte study, shows people that have lost access, and that's my concern that we're not helping people save for their retirement. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
The ranking member, Mr. Scott, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Sue, a lot of the Republicans of the committee may not like the law. The fact is, the Constitution and present statutes have you legally serving as acting Secretary of Labor. They may not like it, but you're there, and it's certainly legal. In terms of child labor, we have another example of some in Congress complaining about something as if it's a solution. We've seen this in immigration. There are a lot of complaints about what's going on in immigration. When you have a bill come up to do something about it, they kill the bill, say out loud that if we pass the law, it means that we wouldn't be able to campaign on it, and then go back to complaining. Well, we have previously, I sent a letter along with Dr. Adams to Chairman Fox and asking for a hearing on child labor. Haven't had it yet. We had with Senator Casey and Representative Kildee, we sent a letter to the GAO asking them, since we couldn't get it done through the committee, to study the situation with child labor. But there's also no support for our bill to increase fines for child labor violations. We find that even adjusting for inflation, the funding for enforcement funding is down. With all that going on, can you tell us what some Republican governors are doing in the child labor space?
So unfortunately, Ranking Member, at the same time that we see devastating cases involving children working in illegal and harmful conditions, there are some rollbacks in states of child labor protections.
Thank you. You mentioned showing up for work. Isn't it a fact that many Department of Labor employees work at places other than their offices, working hard, like inspections and things like that?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And we've had this incredible back and forth about a choice about being an independent contractor or an employee. Can an employee elect to be an independent contractor and not be eligible for minimum wage and other protections? Or probably more accurately, in real life, can an employer tell a prospective employee, if you want to work here, you're going to be an independent contractor, you want to work here, and if they say okay, can the employer then strip the employee of their right to minimum wage, overtime, workers' comp, unemployment compensation, OSHA protection, or health and pension benefits that other employees get because he can call them, because the employee agreed to be an independent contractor and the employer can save a lot of money doing that? Or does the employer have to follow the law?
Yes, Ranking Member, employers have to follow the law.
The job numbers have been discussed. First of all, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, doesn't it happen every month? They revise last month's numbers. And that happen every month? Hadn't it been going on forever?
Yeah, the revisions to the numbers are part and parcel of what the BLS does. And the reason why they do that is, and the reason why they're recognized as the most accurate and reliable source of employment information is because they have a vast body of data on which they rely.
So this is nothing new. The fact that they're revising numbers is nothing new.
And then they make revisions to be accurate.
Okay,
correct?
In terms of numbers, in the first 3 years of the Trump administration, he created 6.4 million jobs. Biden created 14.7. Total numbers of the Trump administration ended up losing 2.7 million jobs total. So far, the Biden administration has created 15.2. They talked about the black unemployment. The lowest Trump got was 5.3. Lowest Biden has gotten 4.8. Just put the numbers out there. When Trump left office, it was African American unemployment 9.3. It's now 6.4. The lowest unemployment period for under 4% for 50 years. I don't know how you can spin that other than those are good numbers. And furthermore, the pandemic, President Trump doesn't get any credit for having a pandemic. He had 10 months of a pandemic. President Biden had 2 years of a pandemic to deal with, but he was able to create all this great economy in spite of the pandemic. Under President Trump, the wheels just came off and in the ditch. Mr. Chairman, thank you for. I have to yield back.
And I will recognize the ranking member again for a closing statement.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's evident that the Department of Labor, under the leadership of the Biden administration and legally serving Acting Secretary Sue, remain committed to uplifting workers and families through policies and prioritize the rights and well-being of workers. Despite attempts to undermine this progress, the facts speak for themselves. Thanks to Acting Secretary Sue, wages have increased and critical protections have been restored, and the truthful numbers show it. Moving forward, our priority should be to support the Biden administration's pro-worker, pro-union agenda and advance policies that protect workers' rights and foster the economic growth for all. So I thank you, Acting Secretary Sue, for your leadership and being focused on improving the lives of workers and their families. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Acting Secretary Sue, I'm going to be blunt. It's time for you to step down. This has gotten ridiculous. You've shattered all records as far as an unconfirmed nominee clinging to power. And, you know, regardless of whether this is technically a legal arrangement, which is very much an open question, that's why everything the department does right now is under a legal cloud, it's just wrong. Most people, I think every reasonable person looking at this knows that it's wrong. This isn't the way that it's supposed to work. This isn't what our Constitution puts in place when it comes to the separation of powers. There are plenty of people in this country who are qualified to be Secretary of Labor. And while you are correct that you had it was appropriate for you to become an interim acting secretary for a short period while a new nominee was being confirmed, the fact is it became different when you became that nominee and didn't get confirmed. You tried really hard. You met with lots of senators. The president, the White House, set up a war room to try to get people to confirm you. There was a whole ad campaign about it, and it just didn't work out. The Senate had ample opportunity to confirm you last year. They elected not to. In fact, they returned your nomination at the end of the year. The Senate has had ample opportunity to confirm you this year, and they've chosen not to. So I would implore you to let's do the right thing. It's time for you to resign, and we'll get a new secretary who can go through the process and be confirmed by the Senate. That's what the American people deserve. That's what American workers deserve. There being no further business, this committee stands adjourned.
Mr. Chairman, it's unanimous consent that the letters I referenced earlier be entered into the record along with the report. Slap on the wrist, how it pays for unscrupulous employers to take advantage of workers be entered in the record of the committee hearing.
Without objection, this committee stands adjourned.